She had rehearsed the way she would hold her chin, not too high, which would seem defiant, and not too low, which would seem ashamed. And still, the moment she stepped through the gilded doors of Headington Hall, every careful preparation dissolved like sugar in rain. The ballroom was magnificent in the way that only cruelty can be magnificent. All golden light and sweeping gowns, and the heady perfume of hothouse roses arranged in towering urns along the walls. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, above 300 of England's finest, and the orchestra was already midway through a Viennese piece that seemed designed to make the lonely feel their loneliness more acutely. Lady Alara Ashworth stood at the threshold of it all, her ivory glove resting on the arm of her aunt, Lady Cecilia Price, and she felt, as she always felt in public now, like a word spoken in the wrong language. Present, but untranslatable. Visible, but unseen in the way that mattered. She was 23 years old, and she had once loved rooms like this one. Before you travel any further into Alara's world, dear viewer, I want to pause just for a moment, because what you are about to witness is a story about two people society deemed too damaged to deserve love, and how magnificently, stubbornly, beautifully they proved society wrong. If you are watching this from your living room, your bedroom, your commute, or a quiet corner of the world where you needed exactly this kind of story tonight, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I read every single one. And if this story already has your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who loves a slow burn romance, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let us return to Alara, standing at the edge of a ballroom she once owned, and let us watch what happens when the world decides you are too broken to belong. 3 years had passed since the accident. 3 years since the Ashworth carriage had struck a patch of black ice on the Grantham Road during a February storm and overturned into the frozen ditch below. 3 years since Alara had woken in a physician's candlelit room with her face wrapped in linen and her mother's hand squeezing hers with a pressure that communicated, even before the bandages came off, that something had changed irrevocably. The scar ran from just beneath her left temple in a thin, deliberate-looking curve down to the edge of her jaw, as though some artist had decided to sign her, to claim her, to mark her as belonging now to a different category of woman entirely. It was not grotesque. Physicians had told her so. Her aunt had told her so. Her mother had told her so with the specific, slightly too insistent tone of someone trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. But the world had told her otherwise, and the world, as Alara had learned, speaks louder than mothers. She had missed 2 full seasons. The first, spent in genuine recovery. The physical healing, the headaches, the slow negotiation with mirrors. The second, spent in a kind of grief she had no proper name for, a mourning not of the dead, but of the self she had been before that February night. The girl who had danced until her slippers wore through. The girl who had laughed without calculating how the light would fall on her face. The girl who had been, by general agreement, one of the lovelier prospects of her year, not a great beauty, but possessed of a warmth and a wit that made her the kind of woman rooms were glad to include. That girl, it seemed, had not survived the Grantham Road either. And then there had been Edmund, Lord Pemberton, her betrothed for 11 months, the man who had held her hand in the physician's room on the second day and kissed her knuckles and said all the things a good man ought to say, who had visited her 3 times in the following month with diminishing frequency and increasing discomfort, who had requested a private meeting with her father in March of that first year, and had emerged from the study with the expression of a man who has successfully concluded an unpleasant but necessary piece of business. The engagement, he had explained through her father's intermediary, was being dissolved, not from any lack of feeling naturally, but from a pragmatic recognition that Alara's circumstances had shifted and that it would be unfair, truly unfair to them both, to proceed under false pretenses. He had not been able to look at her when he said it. She had learned later, from a housemaid with loose lips and a kind heart, what Edmund had actually said in her father's study. She is difficult to look at now. 4 words. The kind of sentence a man speaks when he believes no woman will ever repeat it to its subject. He had been wrong about that, as he was wrong about a great many things. And those 4 words had done something to Alara's interior architecture that no physician could set and no amount of time had yet seen fit to repair. So she had withdrawn, quietly, without drama, the way a tide withdraws, leaving the shore entirely changed by its absence. She had read, and walked the grounds at dawn when no one was about, and corresponded with the two friends who had not found her new face inconvenient to their social calendars. She had learned, with grim proficiency, how to be alone in the particular way that women of her class are permitted to be alone, which is to say, surrounded by people and utterly, agonizingly solitary. And then her aunt had come. Lady Cecilia Price was her mother's elder sister, and the most practically compassionate woman Alara had ever known, a widow of 12 years who had buried one husband, outlasted two social scandals of her own, and emerged from both with her spine precisely as straight as it had ever been. She had arrived at Ashworth House in September with 2 trunks, an opinion about everything, and the absolute, immovable conviction that her niece's self-imposed exile was over. "You are not disfigured," she had said on the first evening, over tea, without preamble. "You are marked. There is a considerable difference. Disfigurement is something done entirely to the body. What you are allowing to happen is being done entirely to the spirit. I will not watch it." Alara had argued. She was very good at arguing, even now. She had listed every reason the world had given her to remain indoors. The stares, the whispers, the particular practiced blankness that people arranged their faces into when they did not want to be caught looking. She had mentioned Edmund. She had mentioned the way conversations shifted when she entered them, the way people's eyes traveled to her left cheek before they could stop themselves, the way she had once caught a child in a park pulling at its mother's sleeve and pointing. Cecilia had heard all of it with the patience of a woman who has lived long enough to know that fear dresses itself in very convincing logic, and at the end she had said simply, "The Marquis of Headington's autumn ball is in 6 weeks. We are going." And so here Alara stood. The first few minutes were the worst. They always were. The awareness of being perceived, of the slight recalibration that moved through clusters of guests, as she and Cecilia made their way along the perimeter of the room. She kept her chin at precisely the angle she had rehearsed and fixed her gaze on the middle distance, with an expression she hoped communicated serene indifference, rather than the very loud, very specific terror currently residing behind her sternum. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and held it without drinking, because her hands needed something to do, and she did not yet trust them near her face. A young woman across the room, Miss Arabella Forsyth, if Alara recalled correctly, the daughter of a Derbyshire baronet, leaned toward her companion and said something behind her fan. The companion looked away. The fan rose again. Alara absorbed this with the particular skill she had developed over 3 years, the ability to register cruelty without visibly registering cruelty, to let it pass through her like cold air through a badly fitted window, felt entirely, but not reacted to. She turned slightly, presenting more of her right profile to the room, a habit so unconscious now that she rarely caught herself doing it. "You are not disfigured," she heard Cecilia's voice say inside her. "You are marked." The distinction felt very thin tonight. The orchestra shifted into a waltz, and the floor filled with couples, a turning, glittering constellation of silk and broadcloth and white gloves and borrowed confidence. Alara watched them and felt the old ache with the old familiarity of something that had lived in her chest long enough to be almost comfortable. She had loved to waltz. She had been considered rather excellent at it, once, light on her feet, possessed of a natural musicality that her dancing master had complimented without flattery. She had danced this very kind of waltz in rooms like this one, and she had been happy doing it, and that happiness felt now like a country she had been deported from and was no longer permitted to enter. She was not going to dance tonight. She knew that. She had known it before she arrived. She was here only to exist, to prove to herself and to Cecilia and to the watching, whispering ton that she could occupy a public space without dissolving. That was the whole of her ambition for the evening. Existence. The very smallest possible victory. She turned toward the tall windows at the far end of the room, where the autumn garden pressed its dark shapes against the glass, and she breathed. And that was when she felt it, that particular shift in atmosphere that precedes something significant, The way the air in a room changes just before a storm breaks, or a door opens onto something unexpected. A ripple of attention moved through the ballroom like a wind across still water, a collective reorientation of faces toward the entrance. And Alara turned, because she was human and curious, and because something in her blood told her, without reason, to look. The man standing in the doorway of Headington Hall was tall, dark-coated, and late. He surveyed the room with the unhurried authority of someone who has never, in his entire life, worried about what a room thought of him. His jaw was set. His eyes were dark and unreadable at this distance. And there, visible above his white cravat along the left side of his neck and disappearing into his collar, a scar. Long, raised, and entirely unapologetic. Alara did not know, in that moment, who he was. She would learn his name within the next 5 minutes, because his name was on everyone's lips, moving through the ballroom in that particular urgent undertone reserved for the powerful and the dangerous and the devastatingly interesting. Dorian Blackwell, the Duke of Ashvale. And he was, by every account she was about to receive, a man who absolutely, categorically never danced. He had come because his solicitor had left him no dignified alternative. This was not the sort of admission Dorian Blackwell, 5th Duke of Ashvale, would have made to any living person, but it was the truth, and he had a complicated, sometimes inconvenient relationship with truth that had survived the war, 2 London seasons of deliberate social abstinence, and 4 years of the kind of solitude that people called brooding from the outside and called necessary from the inside. His solicitor, Mr. Fenn, had presented the matter with the careful diplomacy of a man who knew his employer's temper and respected it sufficiently to work around it rather than against it. The Marquis of Headington was a significant landholder in 3 counties that bordered Ashvale's own estates. There were agreements to be renewed, boundaries to be discussed, a water rights negotiation that had been pending for 8 months, and would continue to pend unless someone with a title and a face attached to it appeared in person and demonstrated the basic social willingness that separated civilized negotiation from protracted legal misery. "It is one evening, Your Grace," Fenn had said, with the expression of a man placing a very small, very reasonable thing on the table between them. Asterisk, merely one evening. Asterisk. Dorian had looked at him for a long moment, and then said nothing, which Fenn had correctly interpreted as reluctant assent. And so here he was. One evening. Headington Hall. 300 people, and an orchestra playing music that ricocheted off the gilded ceiling in a way that made the inside of his skull feel crowded. He did not take a drink from the first footman who approached him, because he intended to remain entirely clear-headed and to conclude his business with Headington before the 2nd hour, after which he would take his leave quietly and return to the considered silence of Ashvale House, where the rooms were large enough that a man could breathe without someone else's perfume in his lungs. He scanned the room with the systematic efficiency that 4 years of military command had made automatic. Entrances, exits, clusters of social weight, the location of his host. He identified Headington near the far fireplace, surrounded by a constellation of other landholders and their respective satellites. He began to move. He was aware of being watched. He was always aware of being watched, in the particular way that awareness becomes just another background condition, like cold or noise, when it is sufficiently constant. The scar on his neck was not something he made effort to conceal. He had tried that briefly in the first months after he returned from France. Higher cravats, more elaborate folds, the small exhausting theater of misdirection, and had abandoned the project not from bravado, but from a simple pragmatic calculation. The scar was there. It was not leaving. Every ounce of energy spent disguising it was an ounce of energy withheld from something that actually mattered. He had made his peace with the arithmetic of it, if not always with the thing itself. What he had not made peace with, what he suspected, in his most honest private hours, he might never fully make peace with, was what the scar represented. Not the wound. The wounding. The particular set of circumstances that had put a French bayonet along the left side of his neck in a narrow pass outside Toulouse on a gray April morning, and the particular person whose decisions had arranged for Dorian to be standing in that pass in the first place. But that was not a thought for a ballroom. He filed it behind the locked door inside himself where he kept everything that could not be usefully acted upon, and continued toward Headington. He was perhaps 20 feet from his host when the thing happened that he would later identify, much later, in the privacy of retrospect, as the precise moment the evening ceased to be about water rights. He saw her. She was standing near the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, slightly apart from the nearest cluster of guests in the way that spoke not of chosen solitude, but of the solitude that is imposed by other people's decisions about where to position themselves. She held a champagne glass she was not drinking from. Her gown was pale green, the color of early spring light on still water, and her dark hair was dressed simply, without the elaborate ornamentation that seemed to be fashionable this season. She was turned slightly away from the room, presenting her right profile to the crowd, and even at this distance Dorian could see the precision of the angle, too consistent to be accidental, too practiced to be natural. Someone who had learned, through repetition and pain, exactly which face to show the world. He could see the scar from where he stood, the line of it along her left cheek, catching the candlelight at a particular angle that made it more visible than she likely knew. And he watched, because he was a man who had trained himself to observe without reacting, which meant he could watch things that other people looked away from. And what he saw was not the scar. What he saw was the quality of stillness around her, the way she held herself inside a room that was not holding her back. The particular dignity of a person who has decided to remain standing when every ambient signal in the environment is suggesting they ought not to have come. He recognized it. In the dispassionate, documentary way of someone examining a mirror they have not looked into for a long time. He recognized it completely. He redirected toward Headington and conducted his business efficiently and without excessive warmth, which was a standard mode of conducting all business, and which Headington seemed to find refreshing rather than offensive. The man was 70, practical, and had no patience for the performance of cordiality. They agreed on the framework of the water rights negotiation in 11 minutes. Headington refilled his own glass, shook Dorian's hand, and turned back to his other guests. The business was concluded. Dorian was free to leave. He stayed. He was not, at the time, entirely certain why. He told himself it was because departing within 30 minutes of arriving would be interpreted as an insult to his host, and would complicate the goodwill he had just spent 11 minutes carefully constructing. This was a reasonable explanation, and contained enough truth to be serviceable. He accepted a drink, champagne, because the alternative was brandy, and brandy in a ballroom led to the kind of loosening he preferred to avoid, and positioned himself near the eastern wall, where the crowd was thinnest and the sight lines were longest. He did not watch her deliberately. He simply noticed, in the way that his particular variety of attention worked, that his awareness kept returning to her the way a compass needle returns to north, not because he directed it there, but because something in the architecture of the room had apparently decided she was the fixed point. He noticed when a pair of young matrons passed close to her and angled their bodies in the subtle, deniable way that communicated exclusion without ever enacting it openly. He noticed when an older gentleman, someone's uncle, from a look of him, began to approach her and then, at the last moment, veered away with an almost imperceptible adjustment of course that had likely registered to everyone in the vicinity, except possibly the man himself. He noticed the way she absorbed these small cruelties without flinching, the way her chin maintained its angle, the way her eyes stayed fixed on the middle distance with an expression he now recognized as the face a person builds for exactly this purpose, to give the world something to see that is not what is actually happening behind it. He had built such a face himself. He was wearing it right now. The orchestra concluded the waltz and shifted into a country dance, and the floor reshuffled itself with the cheerful noise of people who were having the sort of evening this kind of occasion was designed to produce. Dorian watched the woman by the window. She had not moved, had not been asked to dance, had not, as far as he had observed, been approached by anyone with anything resembling genuine social warmth. She existed at the edge of the room like a painting hung in a hallway, present, but not quite part of the collection. He became aware of a voice at his left shoulder. Lord Carlisle, an acquaintance of the most superficial variety, A man whose primary talent was the circulation of information about other people. Ashvale. Didn't expect to see you out. Headington, Dorian said, by way of explanation that required no elaboration. Yes. Carlyle followed his gaze, which Dorian corrected immediately, shifting his eyes toward the dance floor, but not before Carlyle had caught the direction. The Ashworth girl, Carlyle said, in the tone of someone producing an interesting exhibit. First time out in, 3 years? Carriage accident, the Grantham Road. Terrible business. Pemberton threw her over afterward. Dorian said nothing. Can't entirely blame him, I suppose, Carlyle continued, with the comfortable cruelty of a man who has never had to account for his comfortable cruelties. A man in his position, with his prospects, one has to be pragmatic. She was a pretty enough girl before, but now, he made a small gesture, the kind that completed the sentence, without technically saying the words. Now, Dorian said, very quietly, very evenly, in the tone that anyone who knew him well would have recognized as the one immediately preceding something unpleasant. She is standing in a room full of people, and none of them are worth a quarter of what she appears to be. That would seem to be the operative observation. Carlyle blinked, opened his mouth, closed it again. If you will excuse me, Dorian said. He was not entirely certain, as he set his champagne glass on the tray of a passing footman, where he was going. He was not a man who acted without a considered purpose. Impulsivity was something he had excised from himself with the same systematic rigor he applied to everything he deemed counterproductive. And yet his feet were carrying him across the ballroom floor with the calm, direct intention of a man who has decided something, even though the deciding had happened below the level of conscious thought, in some older and less governable part of him. The crowd parted for him, it always did, and the whispers that followed his progress across the room were the familiar whispers, the ones about the scar and the war and the 4 years of absence and the rumored coldness. He heard them the way he heard most things, registered, catalogued, and accorded precisely the weight they deserved, which was very little. He walked to the tall windows at the far end of Headington Hall. He stopped before the woman in the pale green gown. She turned, startled, he thought, though she mastered it quickly, composing herself in an instant with the reflexive speed of someone for whom composure has become a survival skill rather than a social grace. Up close, she was, he catalogued this with the same neutral precision he applied to all observation, striking in the particular way of faces that have been through something and wear it honestly. Her eyes were gray. The scar along her left cheek was exactly as visible here as it had been from across the room, and he did not look away from it, because looking away would have been a form of the same cruelty everyone else in this room had been performing all evening, and he had no interest in participating. She was waiting for him to speak. He could see her preparing, building the expression, readying the polite, careful words she had probably rehearsed for unexpected encounters. She expected, he realized, to be pitied, or curiosity satisfied, or some variety of the social interaction she had been subjected to all evening. He did not pity her. He did not have the architecture for it. He extended his gloved hand. "Dance with me," he said. The waltz had not yet ended. Alara's hand had not yet touched his. She stood with Dorian Blackwell's gloved palm extended between them like a question the universe had not warned her it intended to ask, and the world, this golden, whispering, watching world, had contracted to the precise diameter of the space between his outstretched fingers and her own gloved hand, which she became suddenly and acutely aware she was not moving. She had said nothing yet. She was aware of this. She was also aware that people were looking, not the sideways, deniable surveillance she had been subjected to all evening, but the open, unguarded staring of a crowd that has witnessed something unexpected and has not yet decided how to rearrange its face around it. The Duke of Ashvale, who did not dance, was standing before the Ashworth girl, who was not danced with, and his hand was out, and the entire room was holding its breath in the particular collective way of people who understand they are watching something they will be discussing for the next fortnight. She almost said no. The word was fully formed in her throat, polite, gracious, protecting her from whatever this was, when something stopped it. Not courage, not yet. Something more preliminary than courage. a question. She looked at his face, really looked, the way she had been too startled to look in the first instant. And she searched it with the careful, practiced eye of a woman who has learned that people's faces carry the truth their words are designed to conceal. She looked for the particular expression she had learned to identify over 3 years of re-entry into public spaces. The slight contraction around the eyes that indicated discomfort being managed. The careful blankness of pity arranging itself into something more palatable. The faint quality of performance that lived in the expressions of people who were doing something for the story they would tell about it later. She found none of those things. What she found was more unsettling. He was simply waiting, with the vast, unhurried patience of a man for whom the opinion of the watching room was genuinely, structurally irrelevant. His dark eyes were on her face, and they were steady, and they did not travel, not once, to the left side of her jaw, which was the involuntary journey everyone's eyes took eventually. The small betrayal that no amount of social training had yet managed to fully suppress in the people she encountered. His eyes stayed on hers, as though her face were, in its entirety, simply her face, not a problem to be navigated or a wound to be politely ignored or a curiosity to be satisfied. Just the face of a person he had asked to dance. The almost no dissolved. But before she could move, before whatever was shifting inside her chest could complete its movement and carry her hand forward, the thing happened that would complicate everything that followed and leave a bruise on the evening that even the waltz would not entirely cover. She heard his voice. Not Dorian's. The other one. Edmund Pemberton had a voice that had once sounded like safety to her, warm, well-modulated, the product of an Eton education and a naturally pleasing instrument. She had loved that voice once, had closed her eyes at garden parties to let it wash over her, had saved the letters he had written in it, had believed, with the whole unguarded credibility of a woman who has not yet learned to doubt such things, that it was a voice that meant what it said. She knew now precisely what it was worth. He had arrived, apparently, in the last half hour. She had not seen him come in, which was either fortune or its opposite, depending on how the next few minutes resolved. He was standing perhaps 30 feet away, near the entrance to the adjoining supper room. And he was not alone. Beside him stood a young woman Alara did not recognize, fair-haired, pink-cheeked, unmarked in every visible sense, wearing an expression of the particular uncomplicated happiness that belongs to people for whom the world has not yet presented its invoice. His fiancée. Alara had heard of the engagement through the ordinary channels of information that flow through society, whether or not one is participating in it. A baronet's daughter from Wiltshire, 19 years old. A considerable fortune attached. Everything Edmund had needed, in a form that did not require him to look at anything difficult. He had not seen Alara yet. Or, if he had arranged his attention so as not to indicate it, which amounted functionally to the same thing. Dorian's hand was still extended. Alara looked back at him, at the steady dark eyes, at the scar above his cravat that he wore with an indifference so complete it had long since become something else. Not indifference, she thought. Something more intentional. The deliberate refusal to apologize for one's own face. She recognized the concept. She had simply never managed to enact it. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, firm, unhesitating. The grip of a man who does not extend invitations he is prepared to withdraw. And he led her toward the floor, and the crowd parted the same way it had parted for him on his way across the room, and the music continued its turning, golden spiral, and Alara fixed her eyes on a point just past his shoulder and tried to remember how to breathe in the normal, unconsidered way that breathing is supposed to work. They had barely taken their first measure together when she felt it. The shift in the room's attention that told her Edmund had seen her. She could not have explained precisely how she knew. Perhaps it was the particular quality of silence that opened in a small radius near the supper room doorway. Perhaps it was something more animal than that, the specific, skin-level awareness that develops in people who have been hurt by a particular source, a kind of peripheral alarm system that does not require the eyes to function. She did not look toward him. She kept her eyes where they were, past Dorian's shoulder, and she danced. Dorian danced with a contained precision of someone who had learned the form thoroughly and executed it without ornament. No flourishes, no performance, but nothing missing either. He moved with a quiet authority that made the steps feel less like a social convention and more like a decision, each one deliberate, each one sure. His hand at her waist was correct, proper, and yet carried a warmth through the layers of fabric and glove that she was not prepared for and did not know what to do with. "You are counting," he said. His voice was low enough that only she could hear it above the music. It was not an accusation. It had the tone of an observation, the same neutral, cataloging quality she had noticed in his eyes. She glanced at him, startled. "I beg your pardon?" "Your lips," he said. "They move slightly. You are counting the measures." She felt heat climb her right cheek, the cheek that was still, by the world's accounting, the acceptable one. "I have not danced in some time." "Nor have I," he said. And then, after the briefest pause, so brief she might have imagined it, "We are managing." Something in the plainness of it, the sheer, undecorated utility of "we are managing," moved through her in a way that more elegant words would not have. She had been braced for flattery, which she would not have trusted, or for stilted pleasantry, which she would have endured. She was not braced for this. She adjusted her grip slightly and stopped counting. They danced. And across the room, near the supper room entrance, Edmund Pemberton watched. She knew this not because she looked, but because 20 minutes later, when the waltz had concluded and Dorian had returned her with correct formality to the place near the windows where her aunt stood with an expression of barely suppressed triumph, Edmund found his way to her. She heard him before she saw him fully. That voice, the old familiar instrument, now playing in a register she had not previously heard from it. Something tighter than his usual ease. Something with a slight, almost imperceptible edge of a man recalculating. "Lady Alara." He bowed. Precise. Appropriate. Everything Edmund did was precise and appropriate. It was one of the things she had once admired about him, and now understood as the coldest possible quality in a person. The capacity to be perfectly correct at all times, which means the cruelty, when it comes, arrives in equally correct form and leaves no fingerprints. "Lord Pemberton," she said. Her voice was steady. She had worked very hard on her voice over 3 years. "I did not expect to see you this evening." A pause, calibrated. She knew, to land in the space where Enyulukwa would naturally live, conspicuously unfilling it. "Nor I you," she said. His eyes traveled, the familiar journey, the brief stop at her left cheek, the return, and he smiled. It was an excellent smile. She had once thought it genuine. "It is good to see you resuming your place in society. Truly. It must have required considerable." Another pause. This one weighted with the specific gravity of a word he was choosing not to say. Courage. There it was, dressed in the costume of a compliment, carrying the architecture of condescension. The implication that her presence in a public room was an act of overcoming, of lowered expectations met, that she was to be applauded not for who she was, but for the sheer tenacity of continuing to exist in visible form. She recognized it with the clear-eyed fluency of someone who has had 3 years to study the dialect. "How kind," she said, with a smile that gave him nothing. His fiancée appeared at his elbow. Alara saw the girl register her, saw the quick, curious assessment, saw the moment of confusion that crossed her open face as she tried to understand the texture of the interaction she had stepped into. She was not unkind, Alara thought, simply young and unaware of what she did not know. "Allow me to present Miss Winifred Hale," Edmund said. "My affianced, Miss Hale." Alara met the girl's eyes warmly, because none of this was Miss Hale's fault, and because warmth was one of the things Edmund had not managed to take from her, though not for lack of trying. "I wish you every happiness." Miss Hale murmured something gracious and glanced at Edmund with a particular expression of young women who are still in the phase of finding their beloveds' every social interaction fascinating. Edmund smiled at her, different quality of smile, Alara noted, than the one he had deployed on herself. Easier, uncomplicated, the smile of a man who does not have to work at what he is feeling. She absorbed this. It hurt in the specific, low register of an old injury rather than a fresh one. Not sharp, just present. "And the Duke of Ashvale," Edmund said, his voice shifting just slightly, casual, the precision of the casualness indicating it was anything but Seems to have taken an interest in reintroducing you to society. Charitable of him. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Charitable. Not admiring. Not taken with. Charitable. The framing so precise, so perfectly targeted at the exact wound he knew was still open. The question of whether anyone could want her presence for its own sake, or whether proximity to her was always, inevitably, an act of benevolent condescension. Her aunt's hand found her arm. Just briefly, just the pressure of 2 fingers. Alara looked at Edmund Pemberton, really looked, with the same clear, searching gaze she had turned on Dorian's face less than an hour ago. And she thought, you have no idea what you gave up. And you never will, because the version of you that could understand it is not the version of you that exists. She did not say it. She smiled, the smile that gave him nothing, and said, if you will excuse me, and turned away. Across the room, she did not see Dorian Blackwell lower his champagne glass slowly, his dark eyes fixed on Edmund Pemberton's, retreating back, his jaw set with the specific, contained quality of a fury that has decided to be patient. She did not see it, but it was there. She should not have danced with him. This was the conclusion Alara arrived at approximately 4 minutes after the waltz had ended, while her aunt was steering her toward the supper room with the satisfied momentum of a woman who has won an argument she was not technically having out loud. The logic was simple, and she laid it out for herself with the precision of someone who has learned, through accumulated damage, to think carefully before feeling, or at least to attempt it. She did not know the Duke of Ashvale. She did not know his reasons. She did not know what architecture of motivation had carried him across a ballroom floor to stand before her with an outstretched hand. And she had made the fundamental error of accepting the gesture before she had interrogated the source. She knew better than this. 3 years had taught her, among other things, that kindness extended to her in public spaces was rarely uncomplicated. It arrived with attachments, with a quiet expectation of gratitude, or with the self-congratulatory warmth of people who wished to feel generous, or with the social calculation of those who understood that visible compassion toward the unfortunate was a currency that purchased goodwill from onlookers. She had been the recipient of all 3 varieties, in varying combinations, and she had developed a reasonably reliable taxonomy for identifying each. The difficulty was that Dorian Blackwell had not fit any category in her taxonomy. This was, in its own way, more unsettling than if he had. You dance beautifully, Cecilia said, accepting a small plate of cold salmon from a supper room attendant with the composure of a woman for whom the last hour had been entirely expected. Asterisk, both of you. Asterisk. I counted the first 8 measures, Alara said. And then you stopped, Cecilia said. Asterisk, I noticed. Asterisk. Alara did not ask how she had noticed, because Cecilia noticed everything, catalogued it with the efficiency of a woman who had survived on observation for decades, and deployed her observations with the timing of someone who understood that information, like champagne, was best served at the precise right moment. She accepted a plate she had no appetite for and looked out over the supper room. Smaller than the ballroom, warmer, the conversations here more concentrated and therefore more dangerous, and thought about what we are managing had felt like to hear. She did not want to think about it. She thought about it anyway. It had felt, and she was precise with herself about this, because imprecision in self-assessment was a luxury she could not afford. It had felt like being spoken to rather than spoken at, which ought to have been a low bar, which was, objectively, one of the most fundamental things a person could offer another person in conversation. And yet she had encountered it so rarely in 3 years of public interaction, the quality of being addressed as a full person rather than a circumstance, that the plainness of those 3 words had moved through her like light through a room that had been shut too long. This was, she told herself firmly, not a foundation upon which anything sensible could be constructed. She was still in the process of telling herself this when Cecilia, with the serene efficiency of a woman executing a plan she had held in reserve, said, asterisk, he is looking at you again. Asterisk. Alara did not turn. Asterisk, who is? Asterisk. Her aunt's expression communicated several things simultaneously, chief among them the opinion that this question did not merit a verbal response, and so did not receive one. Alara turned. He was standing at the far end of the supper room, near the doorway that connected back to the ballroom, with the untouched glass in his hand, and the expression she was beginning to suspect was simply his face, that quality of contained, unhurried attention that made him look at all times, as though he was seeing more than other people and finding most of it unsurprising. He was not staring. It was not the fixed, consuming regard of a man making a point. It was more like she searched for the word awareness, the specific awareness of someone who knows where a thing is in a room without needing to keep their eyes on it continuously, but who returns to it at intervals, the way one returns to a fire. He looked away before she finished a thought, back to the man beside him, an older fellow she did not recognize, and the conversation resumed without visible interruption. She turned back to her plate. "He is the most decorated officer in the Peninsular Campaign," Cecilia said, in the tone of someone resuming an observation that had merely been paused. Asterisk, 3 commendations. The scar is from Toulouse, a bayonet, from what the accounts say, though the details are not agreed upon. He has not danced publicly since his return, or so I am told by people whose business it is to know such things. Asterisk. You researched him, Ilara said. I research everything, Cecilia said pleasantly. Asterisk, he has a reputation for being cold, which I suspect is actually a reputation for being honest. There is considerable confusion between those two things in society. He does not gamble beyond his means. He does not keep a mistress that anyone knows of. He does not appear in the scandal sheets except occasionally as a subject of disappointed speculation from people who wish he would behave badly and provide them with material. He manages his estates himself, which is unusual for a man of his position, and by all accounts manages them well. Asterisk. Asterisk, Aunt Cecilia. Asterisk. Asterisk, yes. Asterisk. Asterisk, why are you telling me this? Asterisk. Her aunt smiled, small, precise, and enormously self-satisfied. Asterisk, I am telling you because you are going to want to know it later, and I prefer to be efficient. Asterisk, she took a composed bite of salmon. Asterisk, eat something, my darling. You will need your strength. Asterisk. Ilara ate something, because arguing with Cecilia at a supper table was a project with a very poor expected return, and because, if she was honest, the waltz had left her slightly unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the steps, and everything to do with the 3 years of accumulated stillness that a single dance had, without her permission, begun to disturb. The rest of the evening passed in the modified, manageable way of evenings that have already delivered their significant event, and are now simply completing their runtime. She spoke with 2 women she knew from before, both kind, both slightly awkward in the way of people who are genuinely fond, but have not yet developed fluency in the new grammar of her situation. And she endured one additional encounter with a minor baronet who addressed his entire conversation to Cecilia while standing directly in front of Ilara, which was a variety of social erasure she had long since ceased to find remarkable. She did not see Edmund again at close quarters, for which she was grateful in the practical, unsentimental way of someone removing a variable that would otherwise require management. She did not speak to Dorian Blackwell again. She was aware of him at intervals in the way that Cecilia had described, not continuous attention, but the periodic return of awareness to a specific point in the room. When he moved, she knew it without necessarily tracking it. When, approximately an hour after the supper room, she located him near the entrance to the card room in conversation with Headington himself, she was unsurprised to find that she had been, in some ambient, peripheral way, approximately aware of his position the entire time. This was interesting and inconvenient, and she decided not to examine it. Cecilia called for the carriage at 11, earlier than fashionable, later than Ilara would have chosen. And as they collected their wraps from the anteroom and moved toward the front entrance, Ilara allowed herself one final survey of the room. The habit of someone who has spent years positioning themselves near exits, the need, before leaving, to know the shape of the space they are departing. He was near the west wall. Alone for the moment, his champagne glass held loosely, his eyes on the middle distance. The scar on his neck caught the candlelight at the same angle she had noticed when he first walked in. Unapologetic, unadorned, simply part of a landscape of his face and throat. He was not looking at her. And then, in the last moment before she turned toward the door, he was. Not the quick, deniable glance of someone caught looking. A direct, unhurried acknowledgement of exactly the kind she had been searching people's faces for all evening and finding absent. He held her gaze for the space of approximately 3 seconds, which is simultaneously a very short time. And in a ballroom where no one has looked at you like a complete person all night, an almost overwhelming one, he inclined his head, the smallest, most correct gesture of farewell, and then he looked away, back to the middle distance, as though everything had been said that needed saying. Alara turned toward the door. In the carriage, Cecilia spoke of small things, the Marchioness's gown, the quality of the salmon, the inferior arrangement of the roses in the east urn, and allowed the large things to occupy the silence without naming them, which was one of her greatest gifts as a companion. The London streets moved past the carriage windows in their nighttime palette of lamplight and dark, and Alara rested her head against the cold glass and felt the evening settle around her like sediment after water has been disturbed. She had gone to Headington Hall to prove she could exist in a public room without dissolving. She had danced. She had not dissolved. These were the facts. She assembled them carefully. The way she assembled all important things and held them at a slight distance. The way one holds something that is still too warm to touch comfortably. Tomorrow she would be sensible about all of it. Tomorrow she would restore the necessary protective clarity about who Dorian Blackwell was, a stranger, a duke, a man with his own history and his own wounds and his own entirely unknown reasons for extending a hand to a woman standing alone by a window. And she would not make the error of constructing a narrative around 3 seconds of eye contact and a single waltz. Tomorrow she would be very sensible. She closed her eyes in the dark carriage and heard, with an interior fidelity that was frustrating in its precision, the particular low register of his voice saying, "We are managing," and felt the same thing she had felt when he said it, which was not a thing she had a sensible word for yet, and which she suspected, with a complicated mixture of apprehension and something warmer, was going to resist being named for some time. Outside the carriage windows, London moved through its midnight indifference, and Alara Ashworth rode home through it with her eyes closed and her chin at precisely the angle she had rehearsed, and something small and stubborn, and not yet fully identified turning itself over quietly in the center of her chest. The gossip arrived before breakfast. This was not unusual in London during the season. Information traveled through the social infrastructure of the city with a speed that would have impressed military dispatchers, moving along the established channels of morning calls, correspondence, and the particular telegraph system of ladies, maids who spoke to footmen, who spoke to coachmen, who spoke to everyone. But the speed with which the previous evening's Waltz had completed its circuit of the ton and returned, annotated and interpreted, to Ashworth House on Welbeck Street was impressive even by these standards. It arrived in the form of 3 calling cards slipped under the door before 9, 2 letters delivered with the Morning Post, and Lady Cecilia herself appearing at Alara's bedroom door at 8:30 with an expression that managed to contain both satisfaction and the careful neutrality of someone who intended to let Alara reach her own conclusions before offering editorial commentary. The letters were from women Alara knew, with varying degrees of intimacy. The first from a Mrs. Hartwell, a warm acquaintance from before the accident, the kind of woman who is reliably decent without being remarkable, expressed delight at seeing Alara at the ball, and hoped she was well, and wasn't the evening lovely, and by the way, purely as an aside, everyone was talking about the Duke of Ashvale. Wasn't that something? The second letter was less warm and more direct. A note from Lady Forsyth, mother of the fan-wielding Arabella, whom Alara had observed the previous evening, written in the specific register of a woman who has decided to recalibrate her social positioning with brisk efficiency. Lady Forsyth looked forward to calling on Lady Alara at her earliest convenience, and had always found her quite charming, always even. And here the letter performed a small grammatical pirouette around the 3-year gap, through everything. Alara read both letters, and set them aside with the flat effect of someone performing emotional triage. She understood what they represented. She had been invisible to these women, to this entire stratum of society, for 3 years, and then a duke with a war record and an unsmiling face had crossed a ballroom floor and put his hand out, and suddenly she was visible again. Not because she had changed, not because the scar was different or the history was revised or the woman underneath either had been newly discovered. Because a powerful man had indicated, through the vocabulary of public gesture, that she was worth approaching. The thought should perhaps have been more gratifying than it was. Instead, it sat in her chest with the specific weight of something that is technically good news and emotionally complicated. The confirmation that her reinstatement to the margins of social acceptability was contingent not on who she was, but on who had recently stood beside her. She was being seen because he had seen her first. She was being deemed worthy of morning calls because a duke had deemed her worthy of a waltz. The mechanism was so perfectly, transparently legible that she felt almost embarrassed on behalf of the people enacting it. She was in the middle of this particular contemplation, dressed and seated at the small writing desk in her room with a cup of cooling tea and no real intention of drinking it, when Cecilia appeared again, this time fully in the room rather than at the threshold, which indicated she had something specific to say. "There's a card," Cecilia said, and placed it on the desk before Alara. It was heavier stock than the morning's other correspondence. The engraving was simple, no flourishes, no ornamental border, the kind of card that communicates wealth through restraint rather than display. She read the name embossed upon it and felt something happen in the region of her sternum that she immediately moved to classify as surprise, which was accurate, and refused to classify as anything else, which required somewhat more effort. Dorian Blackwell, Duke of Ashvale, and beneath it, in handwriting that was spare and unhesitating and took up exactly as much space as it needed. Asterisk, I would call this afternoon, if that is convenient. 3 o'clock, asterisk. Not a question, she noted. Not precisely a statement either. Something in between. The form of an inquiry made in the tone of a man who plans his days with sufficient confidence that the inquiry is largely administrative. Cecilia was watching her with the patience of a woman who has already decided what the correct answer is and is allowing the other party the courtesy of arriving there independently. "It is not convenient," Alara said. "I see," said Cecilia, in the tone of someone who sees a great deal more than the immediate statement. "I do not know him," Alara said. Asterisk, one dance does not constitute an acquaintance. One dance constitutes a dance. People will talk. Asterisk. People, Cecilia said, with the serenity of a woman who has outlived several generations of people, and their talking, asterisk, are already talking. The question is not whether they will talk, but whether what they say will be worth listening to. Asterisk, she paused. Asterisk, he called correctly. He sent a card ahead. He has proposed 3 o'clock, which is a perfectly respectable hour for a morning call, and I will be present throughout. There is nothing in the form of this that is improper. Asterisk. Asterisk. It is not the form I am concerned about. Asterisk. I know, Cecilia said more gently. Asterisk. But Alara, he is not Edmund. Asterisk. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped onto a wooden floor, unavoidable, reverberant, producing an echo neither of them pretended not to hear. Alara looked at the card on the desk, at the spare, unhesitating handwriting, at the words, if that is convenient, written in the tone of a man who genuinely means them, she thought, who would, in fact, not come if told it was not. 3 o'clock, she said. Cecilia permitted herself the smallest possible smile. Asterisk. I will have Hutchins prepare the blue sitting room. Asterisk. The hours between morning and 3 o'clock had a peculiar quality, the stretched, slightly unreal texture of time that is being waded through rather than lived in. Alara read, without absorbing much of what she read. She walked the length of the townhouse garden, which was not long, twice. She sat at the piano in the back parlor and played 2 pieces with the mechanical precision of someone using music as an organizational tool rather than an expressive one. She changed her dress once, and then changed it back, and then stood in front of the mirror in her room with the particular stillness of a woman conducting a private negotiation with her own reflection. The face in the mirror was her face. She had been relearning this for 3 years, the slow, uneven, frequently arrested process of re-recognizing oneself after the self has been altered. On good days, she looked at her reflection with something approaching neutrality, the way one looks at any landscape that contains both difficult and unremarkable features. On less good days, she looked with the specific grief of someone who knows exactly what used to be there. Today was neither a good day nor a less good day. Today was a complicated day. And her face in the mirror was the face of a woman about to receive a caller she did not know how to categorize. And it showed. She straightened her chin. She went downstairs. He arrived at 3 o'clock precisely, not a minute before or after, which she noted and filed away without yet knowing what to do with it. Hutchins showed him into the blue sitting room, where Cecilia was already installed with needlework she did not intend to pay attention to, and Alara stood near the fireplace because standing felt more defensible than sitting. The ability to move being, she had found, an important psychological resource. She registered this with a detached portion of her attention, different in daylight. The ballroom had given him a dramatic quality, all deep shadows and candlelight and the context of 300 watching people, that had made him feel slightly mythological. In the sitting room's gray afternoon light, he was simply a tall man in a dark coat, with a scar on his neck and a direct gaze and the posture of someone who has spent enough time being responsible for other people's lives that relaxation has never entirely reclaimed its original territory. He greeted Cecilia with the correct formalities and turned to Alara. Asterisk, Lady Alara. Asterisk. Asterisk, Your Grace. Asterisk, she gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. Asterisk, please sit. Asterisk. He sat. She sat. Cecilia made a small production of threading a needle. The fire offered its uncomplicated commentary. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which is longer than it sounds. He did not appear troubled by it. She had the distinct impression he was comfortable in silence in the way that people are comfortable in spaces they have spent a great deal of time in, not fond of it necessarily, but familiar with its dimensions. You are wondering why I am here, he said. I am wondering several things, she said. Asterisk, that is among them. Asterisk. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, exactly. The movement of a smile, considering whether to commit. Asterisk. I am here because I wish to call. The reasons are not complicated. Asterisk. In my experience, she said carefully, asterisk, the apparently uncomplicated reasons are generally the ones worth examining most closely. Asterisk. He looked at her for a moment. That is a fair position, he said. Asterisk, given what your experience has been. Asterisk. The plainness of it, the direct, unadorned acknowledgement that he knew something of what she had been through and was not going to pretend otherwise, produced in her the same quality of disorientation that we are managing had produced the previous evening. She had been prepared for pleasantries. She had prepared responses to pleasantries. She had not prepared responses to honesty, which is always the more dangerous conversational mode. The waltz, she began, was not charity, he said. Asterisk, if that is the question. Asterisk. She absorbed this. Asterisk, people are saying that it was. Asterisk. People, he said, with a flatness that communicated a thorough and long-established indifference to the category. Asterisk, say a great many things. Asterisk. It matters, she said, and heard, as she said it, the slight edge in her own voice, the place where careful composure met something raw underneath it. Asterisk, it matters to me, Your Grace, for reasons that I suspect you understand well enough not to require explanation. Whether what happened last night was genuine, or whether it was the variety of gesture that a man makes because he understands it will reflect well on him, it matters. I am not in a position to be. Asterisk, she stopped. Recalibrated. Asterisk, I have been managed with kindness before. I am not interested in repeating the experience. Asterisk. The fire settled. Outside, the gray afternoon moved against the sitting room windows. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man formulating a socially effective response, she thought, not the strategic pause. The silence of a man deciding how honest to be, and then deciding to be more honest than was strictly necessary. I crossed the room, he said, asterisk, because you were the only person in it who was doing what I have been doing for 4 years. Asterisk. She waited. Surviving a room, he said. Asterisk, rather than inhabiting one. I recognized it. I did not plan to act on the recognition. He paused. I acted on it anyway. Asterisk. The room was very quiet. Cecilia's needle moved through her fabric with the small, precise sound of someone being extraordinarily tactful. Alara looked at Dorian Blackwell, at the steady, guarded, entirely unperforming face of a man who has just said a true thing and is not going to embellish it, and felt something shift in the architecture of her wariness. Not collapse, not dissolve. Something more structural than that. A single stone, repositioning itself in a wall, changing the load-bearing arrangement of everything adjacent. It was not much. It was not nothing. Asterisk, will you take tea, your grace? Asterisk, she said. The corner of his mouth moved again. This time the smile committed, briefly, to existing, small, unflashy, and more devastating for both qualities. Thank you, he said. Asterisk, yes. Asterisk. He came back on Thursday. This was not, strictly speaking, expected. The conventions of social calling being sufficiently well established that a second visit within the same week carried weight, communicated intention, and would be noted by anyone paying attention, which in London during the season meant approximately everyone. Alara knew this. She suspected Dorian knew it too, and had calculated the social arithmetic, and arrived at a conclusion that the arithmetic was not his primary concern, which was itself a form of communication she filed away and examined later, alone, in the way she was developing the habit of examining everything that pertained to him. He arrived at 2:30 on Thursday with a book under his arm, a volume of botanical illustrations of all things, which he presented to Cecilia with the information that he had heard she kept a garden, and that the illustrations were reputed to be accurate rather than merely decorative, a distinction he suspected she would care about. Cecilia received this gift with a warmth that was entirely genuine and only slightly triumphant, and installed herself in the far corner of the sitting room with the book and her customary needlework in what was technically the correct position for a chaperone and practically the position of a woman, giving two people as much conversational privacy as the rules of her era permitted. Alara noted all of this. The thoughtfulness of the book, specific, observed, not generic. The way he had made it a gift to Cecilia rather than to herself, which would have been presumptuous at this stage, but which accomplished the same warming effect through the more correct channel. The precision of it. She was learning that precision was his primary language, that he moved through the world with the careful, considered intentionality of someone who has seen what happens when things are done carelessly and has resolved not to contribute to that category of outcome. You were a soldier, she said, when the tea had been poured and the preliminary courtesies observed. They had established by the end of Tuesday's visit a mode of conversation that skipped a layer or two of the usual social insulation, not intimate, not yet, but direct in a way that felt, between two people who had each learned the cost of indirection, like the natural register. I was, he said. Asterisk, you do not speak of it. Asterisk. Asterisk, no. Asterisk, a pause of the deciding variety. Asterisk, most people who ask about the war are asking about the scar. The scar is the least interesting part of what happened in France. Asterisk. Asterisk. What is the most interesting part? Asterisk, she asked, and then, catching the potential presumption of the question. Asterisk. You need not answer that. Asterisk. I know, he said. Asterisk. That is why I am going to. Asterisk. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense of watching someone open a door they have kept locked for a long time, not dramatically, not with the emotional performance that such moments are sometimes given in the telling of them, but with the simple, deliberate action of a man who has decided the door should be opened and is doing the thing he has decided. I had a friend, he said. Asterisk, in the army. We had known each other since boyhood, school, then the regiment. There are people you trust in that way that does not require ongoing verification. That is simply the shape of the thing, established early and never questioned. Asterisk, he looked at the fire. Asterisk, he was in command of the section beside mine at Toulouse. He had information from an informant, he said, regarding French positioning in the pass where my section was ordered to advance. He did not share this information. He made a decision that sharing it would compromise a separate operation he was managing, and that the risk to my section was acceptable. Asterisk. Alara said nothing. She could hear the architecture of what he was building toward, and she understood, with the instinctive knowledge of someone who has had their own version of this story, that interrupting it would be a form of damage. 7 men died in that pass, he said. Asterisk. I received the bayonet. I survived. which I have spent a significant portion of the last 4 years examining from multiple angles, and have not yet fully resolved. Asterisk a pause. Asterisk, he visited me in the field hospital. He was appropriately distressed. He said all the things that are said. I did not know then what he had known. I learned it 2 years later from a letter written by the informant in question, who had a conscience that arrived late but arrived. Asterisk. Asterisk, what did you do? Asterisk, Ilara asked. Asterisk, when you learned? Asterisk. Nothing, he said. And then, asterisk, which is its own kind of answer. Asterisk. She understood what he meant. The choice not to act, to carry the knowledge without deploying it, to absorb the betrayal without seeking its accounting, was not passivity. It was a decision, deliberate and costly, made by a man who understood that the actions available to him would not restore the 7 men in the pass, and would cost him the remainder of whatever he had left to spend. It was the kind of nothing that takes everything to choose. I am sorry, she said. The words were plain, and she meant them plainly, without decoration. He looked at her. Thank you, he said. And the way he said it communicated that he was thanking her for the plainness, specifically. For not saying how terrible or how brave or any of the other things people say when they need a large experience to be smaller so it can fit in their hands. The fire settled. The afternoon light shifted. Cecilia turned a page of the botanical illustrations with the soft sound of someone being very present in a separate corner. Your turn, he said. She looked at him. You have been generous enough to ask, he said. Asterisk. I am returning the courtesy. Asterisk. She considered this for a moment. The offer, the framing of it, the specific word generous, which acknowledged that her question had been a gift and not an imposition, and which indicated, by its precision, that he understood the difference. She thought about the wall she had built over 3 years, stone by careful stone, and about the single stone she had felt shift on Tuesday afternoon. And she thought about the fact that she was tired, not sleepy, not even metaphorically exhausted in the dramatic sense, but tired in the deep, structural way of someone who has been performing a particular kind of maintenance for a very long time and has begun to suspect the maintenance is costing more than the wall is worth protecting. The accident itself, she said, asterisk, was not the worst of it. I know that is perhaps not what people expect to hear, but it is true. The worst of it was not the scar or the pain or even the initial adjustment to a different face. I could have managed those things. Asterisk, she paused. Asterisk, I had managed them, more or less, by the end of the first year. I had reached a kind of agreement with the mirror. Difficult, but navigable. Asterisk. Asterisk, what changed? Asterisk, he said. I overheard him, she said. Asterisk, Edmund. Lord Pemberton. 3 weeks before he ended our engagement, at a dinner party his mother gave, I was not supposed to be in the corridor. I had come down early from a headache, and I heard him in the adjoining room speaking to another man. I could not tell you now who the other man was. I only remember his voice, asking whether Pemberton intended to honor the engagement, and Edmund's answer. Asterisk. She stopped. Dorian waited. He was very good at waiting. The kind of waiting that is not impatience suppressed, but genuine, unhurried attention. Asterisk, he said. She is difficult to look at now. Asterisk, Ilara said it in the same register she would use to read a line from a document. Flat, factual. The voice of someone who has repeated this to herself enough times that the words have been worn smooth. Asterisk for words. I have thought about them. I will not give you an exact accounting of how often, because the number is embarrassing. And I understand intellectually that they are the words of a limited man and that they say nothing of genuine authority about who I am or whether I deserve to be looked at. I understand this. And yet, asterisk. And yet, he said. And yet I have not been in a room since that night, she said, asterisk, without hearing them. Without calculating whether I am difficult, whether I am presenting myself at the correct angle, whether the light is managed, whether the expression on my face is sufficient compensation for the fact of my face itself. Asterisk, she looked at her hands in her lap. Asterisk, I had not realized, until I said it aloud just now, how very exhausting that has been. Asterisk, the room was quiet. She became aware that she had said more than she had planned to say, not more than was true, but more than she had intended to release in a single conversation. And she felt the small, familiar contraction of a person who has been more honest than their defenses had planned for. She looked up, braced. In the specific way, she was braced for most things, for the careful management of her revelation, for the slight recalibration of expression that indicated a person filing her disclosure under sad situation and preparing the appropriate response. Dorian was looking at her with an expression she did not have a name for. Not pity, not the studied neutrality of compassion being carefully deployed. Something older than either of those things, and more complicated. The expression, she thought, searching for the word and finding it slowly, of recognition, of a person who has heard their own interior said aloud by someone else, and does not quite know what to do with the strange, specific relief of it. He was wrong, Dorian said. Not you are beautiful, which would have been untrue in the way of things said to make a person feel better rather than to tell them the truth. Not you mustn't listen to him, which would have been the advice of someone standing outside the wound rather than acknowledging its existence. Just, he was wrong, said in the tone of a man correcting an error of fact, certain, unadorned, and carrying in its plainness the full weight of a man who does not say things he does not mean. She felt something happen behind her eyes, the specific, involuntary pressure of tears that have been queued for a significant period of time, and have identified an opening. She did not let them through. She had considerable practice in this. But she felt them, and she suspected he saw her feel them, because he looked away at precisely the right moment toward the fire, giving her the privacy of his averted gaze while remaining entirely, steadily present in the room. And this too was a form of precision she recognized as deliberate and felt with a fullness she could not have articulated. They sat in silence for a moment that had the quality of shared territory, both of them standing in the same place, on the same unsteady ground, having arrived there by different paths that had turned out at the last to be the same road. I have not told anyone that, she said. Asterisk, what he said. The words specifically. Asterisk. I know, he said, still looking at the fire. Asterisk, I could tell. Asterisk. Asterisk, how? Asterisk. He turned back. Asterisk, because it is the kind of thing that only stays at that volume if it has never been let out. Asterisk. She thought about this for a long moment, about the specific interior acoustics of words that have been kept sealed, how they do not diminish with time but intensify, bouncing off the interior walls of a person's private architecture until the original 4 words become a weather system, a climate, the very atmosphere in which all subsequent self-perception occurs. She thought about how saying them aloud, here to this man, in this gray-lit room with the fire and Cecilia's turning pages and the thin London afternoon outside, had produced something she had not expected. Not relief, not yet, but a slight, tentative reduction in the volume. You said, she began, carefully, because she was moving toward something she was not certain about, asterisk, that you have not resolved the question of having survived. Asterisk. He looked at her steadily. Asterisk, yes. Asterisk. I think, she said, asterisk, I have a similar unresolved question. Not about surviving the accident. About surviving, after. About what the surviving is supposed to look like. Whether it is enough to simply continue, or whether continuation must eventually become something else. And if so, what? Asterisk. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. She could see him considering it, not performing consideration, but actually moving through the question with the careful, deliberate intelligence she was coming to recognize as his primary mode of being in the world. I think, he said, asterisk, that surviving is the prerequisite, not the answer. Asterisk. Asterisk and the answer? Asterisk. I am not certain yet, he said. Asterisk. I suspect it is different for different people. Asterisk. Asterisk, are you working on yours? Asterisk. The corner of his mouth moved. Asterisk. I am beginning to think I might be. Asterisk. The afternoon moved past the windows in its gray, uncommitted way. Cecilia turned another page. The fire offered its warmth to the room without condition or expectation, in the manner of fires and certain rare people. And Alara Ashworth sat in the blue sitting room of her family's townhouse on Welbeck Street and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the peculiar, fragile, almost frightening sensation of being fully known by another person, not despite her damage, but including it, the damage accounted for in the total rather than tactfully excluded from the sum, and found that she did not quite want to run from it. She wanted to sit with it a little longer. So she did. The enemy at the gate. The whispers began on a Friday. Alara did not hear them directly. Whispers of this particular variety were not designed to be heard directly, which was precisely what made them so effective. They were engineered for the peripheral, for the half-caught sentence, and the significant pause, for the expression that changes just slightly when a name is mentioned and then smooths itself back to neutral before anyone can formally account for the change. They moved through the drawing rooms and morning calls and afternoon promenades of London society with a quiet, systemic efficiency of water finding its way through stone, patient, purposeful, and leaving its mark without ever appearing to have forced anything. She learned them on Saturday from Mrs. Hartwell, who delivered the information with the anxious warmth of someone who believes that forewarning constitutes a form of protection, which it does, though not always the form the forewarner intends. They had been walking in the park, Alara, Cecilia, and Mrs. Hartwell, who had attached herself to their party at the gates with the slightly breathless energy of someone carrying something she needs to put down, and Mrs. Hartwell had walked beside Alara for a full 10 minutes, discussing the weather and the condition of the paths and the inexcusable decline in the quality of the park's roses before arriving, with visible relief, at her actual subject. "I would not mention it," she said, in the tone of someone who would absolutely mention it, except that I think you ought to know. I think it is better to know. I always think it is better to know, even when knowing is unpleasant, because the alternative is being the last person to know, which is so much worse. What is it, Catherine? Cecilia said, with the pragmatic efficiency of a woman who has been walking through the preamble long enough. Mrs. Hartwell looked briefly grateful for the abbreviation. "There are things being said," she said. About Alara. About the Duke's visits. People are saying. She paused, adjusted the angle of her parasol, pressed forward. "There is a suggestion in certain quarters that Alara that her nerves are not entirely." Another pause, this one longer. That is to say, there are people suggesting that she has not recovered from the accident, as well as appearances indicate. That she is fragile. In temperament. That the Duke's attention is, charitable, Alara said. Mrs. Hartwell blinked. Yes. That word. And furthermore, that it is perhaps unwise of him. That a woman in her circumstances might develop an attachment that he cannot in good conscience reciprocate, and that the kindness is therefore, in the long view, a species of cruelty. The path continued ahead of them, gravel under their feet, and the park's autumn trees releasing their leaves in the mild breeze with a slow, rustling indifference to the conversation below. Alara walked through the information the way she walked through most difficult things, steadily, with her chin at its angle, and the careful processing of it happening internally in the space behind her composed expression. She knew, without requiring time to reach the conclusion, where the whispers had originated. Edmund Pemberton was not a man who acted in obvious ways. This was something she had understood about him even while she loved him. The intelligence behind the pleasantness, the calculation beneath the warmth, and had interpreted, then, as a kind of sophisticated refinement. She understood now that it was simply the specific profile of a person for whom social standing is the primary organizing value of their existence, and who is consequently very skilled at protecting it through means that leave no fingerprints. He would not say anything directly attributable. He would not do anything that could be named and confronted. He would speak to the right people in the right tone of gentle, regretful concern. "I worry about her. Naturally one does, given everything." And the whisper network would do the rest, amplifying and distorting as whisper networks always do, until the original seed of deliberate cruelty had grown into something that looked, from a sufficient distance, like general social consensus. She was unstable. She was fragile. The Duke's interest was charitable, and the charity was misplaced. She should not have come back. She had heard all of these things before. Not in these exact words, but in the structure underneath them. The foundational argument that had been mounted against her for 3 years in various forms. The argument that she was too damaged for regular life, too marked for regular love, too broken for the ordinary human inheritances of companionship and regard and the simple right to occupy a public room without generating concern. She had heard it so many times in so many registers that it had begun, despite everything, to sound like the truth. The way a repeated lie eventually acquires the texture of a thing that has always been known. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Mrs. Hartwell. Asterisk truly. Asterisk. Mrs. Hartwell looked relieved and slightly guilty, which was the correct combination of feelings for the situation. They walked the remainder of the circuit and parted at the gates, and Alara and Cecilia took the carriage home in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was honest in the way that Cecilia's silences always were, containing everything that was being thought without requiring it to be said before it was ready. In the sitting room, with the afternoon settling around them and the remains of tea cooling on the tray, Cecilia finally spoke. "He will call on Monday," she said. Asterisk, "We have already indicated we will receive him." Asterisk. "I know," Alara said. Asterisk, "You are going to tell him not to come again." Asterisk. It was not a question. Alara looked at her aunt, at the sharp, clear, uncommonly honest eyes of a woman who has never had the luxury of self-deception and has not extended that luxury to the people she loves. "I am going to tell him not to come again," Alara confirmed. Asterisk, "Because of the whispers." Asterisk. "Because the whispers are going to become his problem," Alara said. Asterisk. "And he has enough of his own." And because, asterisk, she stopped. The other reason was harder to say, not because it was less true, but because it was more personal, more exposed, the kind of admission that cost something. Asterisk. "Because if I wait much longer, it will be harder to be sensible about it." Asterisk. Cecilia looked at her for a long moment. "Sensible," she said, in the tone of a woman examining a word she finds insufficient. "Sensible," Alara said, with the firmness of someone who has made a decision and intends to implement it before the part of her that disagrees with the decision can fully mobilize. The weekend moved through its hours with the specific, grinding deliberateness of time that contains an unpleasant task waiting at its end. She did not sleep well on Sunday. She lay in the dark of her room and conducted the argument she would conduct with herself on Monday morning about whether she was being wise or whether she was performing wisdom as a proxy for fear, and concluded, each time, that the distinction was perhaps not as important as the outcome. Dorian Blackwell was a duke with a reputation and a history and no obligation whatsoever to absorb the social collateral of being associated with her. The whispers would reach him. They were probably already reaching him. And whatever was beginning between them, in the sitting room with the fire and the botanical illustrations and the shared archive of pain, it was too new and too fragile to survive becoming scandal, and she was not willing to be the thing that damaged him. She had been damaged enough herself to know what it cost. He arrived on Monday at 3 o'clock precisely, as he always did, with the reliability of a man for whom punctuality is a form of respect rather than a social performance. Hutchins showed him in. Cecilia was present as always, but situated today near the window with her back to the room at an angle that provided oversight without proximity, a configuration that Alara recognized as her aunt's way of giving her the space to say a difficult thing without an audience too close to the words. He sat. She remained standing near the fireplace, the position she had taken on Tuesday the week before when she had needed the ability to move, and which she needed again today for the same reason. He looked at her, at the standing and the expression and the quality of the room, which was different today, and which he read, she could see, with the accurate, rapid assessment of a man who has spent significant time in situations where reading a room correctly was a matter of survival. "Something has happened," he said. "Not a question. There are things being said," she told him. Asterisk in society. "About your visits here. About the nature of your interest, and my suitability to be the object of it." Asterisk. She watched him receive this. His expression did not change precisely, but something the set of his jaw altered. A slight, controlled tightening that she had not seen before, and which communicated the particular quality of a man managing a specific, targeted anger. "I see," he said. "They are saying that I am unstable," she continued, because she had determined to say it plainly. The way he said difficult things, without ornamentation, without the padding of softening language that converted the truth into something more bearable but less accurate. Asterisk, that I am fragile, that your attention is charitable, and that the charity is misplaced, that I will develop an attachment you cannot return. Asterisk. A pause. "And you believe this," he said. "I believe," she said carefully, asterisk, "that it does not matter what I believe. What matters is that these things are being said, and they will reach you if they have not already, and I will not." Asterisk, her voice held, just barely, at the edge of the sentence. Asterisk, "I am not willing to be something that causes damage to someone who has given me no cause for it." Asterisk. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, and even and carried in it the specific, contained quality of words that have been kept short, because longer ones would break their banks. "Ilara," he said, her name, without the title, for the first time, and she felt the omission of the formality like a hand removing a barrier she had not realized she was standing behind. Asterisk, who told them? Asterisk. She held his gaze. Asterisk, I have a suspicion. Asterisk. Pemberton, he said. Flat. Certain. Asterisk, I cannot prove it. Asterisk. No, he said. Asterisk, he would have ensured that. Asterisk, the jaw again, that controlled tightening. Asterisk, and your response to this is to remove the target. Asterisk. My response, she said, asterisk, is to protect us both from a situation that benefits no one. Asterisk. That is very generous, he said, and the word generous landed differently this time than it had from Edmund's mouth, not as condescension dressed in courtesy, but as the observation of a man who recognizes sacrifice when he sees it and is not prepared to accept it without a response. He stood. He was very tall in the sitting room, in a way the ballroom had not particularly emphasized. The room scaled him differently, made his presence more contained and therefore more concentrated. He was looking at her with the steady, unguarded directness that had characterized every interaction they had had, the quality that was not performance and was not posturing, but was simply, she had come to understand, who he was. I will go, he said. Asterisk, because you have asked me to, and I respect the asking. Asterisk, a pause, deliberate, and waited. Asterisk, but I want you to know, before I go, that the reason I will comply has nothing to do with agreement. Asterisk. She looked at him. The whispers are wrong, he said. Asterisk, about my reasons. About your suitability. About what this is. Asterisk, he said it in the tone of the man correcting errors of fact. The same tone he had used to say he was wrong the week before. The same absolute, unperforming certainty. Asterisk, I want you to know that. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that the picture they are painting is not the picture. Asterisk. She opened her mouth, closed it. There was something gathering in her throat that she needed a moment to manage. I will see myself out, he said. He turned toward the door, and then paused with his back to her, the scar on his neck visible above his collar in the sitting room's afternoon light. You are not difficult to look at, Ilara, he said quietly. Asterisk, you are the most honest face in every room you enter. I find that the opposite of difficult. Asterisk. He left. The door closed behind him with the soft, final sound of a well-fitted thing returning to its place. Ilara stood at the fireplace for a long moment after the sound had died. The fire continued its commentary. Cecilia, at the window, did not turn around, and the quality of her stillness was the quality of a woman exercising the most profound and loving restraint of which she was capable. You are the most honest face in every room you enter. She heard it the way she had heard he was wrong, in the specific interior register of things that do not land and bounce away, but land and stay, settling into the architecture of a person and beginning, quietly and without permission, to hold weight. She stood at the fireplace and held very still and felt the sentence rearranging things inside her that had been arranged a particular way for 3 years, and she thought, with the first genuine, unguarded clarity she had had in as long as she could remember, that she had just made a terrible mistake. The dinner was Lady Forsyth's idea. This was the first thing Alara would later identify as a warning sign she had not adequately waited, that the invitation had come from Lady Forsyth, whose social calculations were as reliable as cartography and who did not assemble a dinner table without specific intent behind each placement. The note had arrived on Wednesday, 3 days after Dorian's departure from the sitting room on Monday, and it had been worded with the particular gracious insistence of a woman who understands that the form of an invitation can function as a social obligation if constructed carefully enough. A small dinner, intimate, 12 covers only, Thursday evening. Alara's presence would complete the party. Cecilia had read the invitation over Alara's shoulder and said nothing for a moment. "You do not have to go," she said finally. "I know," Alara said. Asterisk, "but you are going to go." Asterisk. "I'm going to go," Alara confirmed. Not because she trusted Lady Forsyth's motives, which she did not. Not because she particularly wanted an intimate dinner of 12 after the week she had had, which she absolutely did not. But because she had spent 3 years making decisions based on what she could survive rather than what she wanted to do, and she was beginning to understand, slowly, painfully, with the specific reluctance of someone dismantling a load-bearing structure without a replacement plan, that survival-based decision-making had its own costs, paid in a currency she was running low on. She had sent Dorian away to protect herself, and had spent 3 days discovering that the protection felt indistinguishable from the wound. She would go to the dinner. She would sit at Lady Forsyth's table, and she would be present. Fully, deliberately, stubbornly present in the way that Cecilia had walked into her room in September and demanded she be present in the world. It was not courage, not yet. It was its immediate predecessor. The decision to act before courage arrives, on the understanding that courage sometimes only shows up after the action has already begun. She wore the green gown again. Not the pale spring water green of Headington Hall, a deeper one, the color of late summer leaves, which Cecilia had produced from a dressmaker's box earlier in the week, with the slightly aggressive cheerfulness of a woman conducting a campaign through the medium of fabric. She dressed with care and precision, and she stood before the mirror and looked at her face, the whole of it, left side included, without the habitual quarter turn toward the safer profile, and she said quietly to the reflection, "He is wrong about you," meaning Edmund. And she said the other thing too, the thing Dorian had said, and let it sit in the room for a moment before she turned away and went downstairs. The dinner was in Mayfair at the Forsyth townhouse, which was decorated in the style of a woman who has excellent taste and wants everyone to know it, beautiful, cold, and slightly exhausting. 12 guests, as promised, arranged with the precision of a military operation around a table that gleamed with silver and candlelight. Alara found her place card and sat, and conducted the first 2 courses with the practiced ease of someone who has learned to perform social fluency even when the instrument is out of tune. She did not see him until the second course. Edmund had been placed, and she understood, as soon as she registered his position, that this was not accidental, that Lady Forsyth had constructed this table with the specific deliberateness of a woman who enjoys watching things happen and has arranged the conditions for them. Directly across from her, he arrived late, which was characteristic, with his fiancée on his arm and the slightly theatrical air of a man making an entrance he has calculated to appear uncalculated. He found his seat, found her face across the table, and smiled the smile that gave her nothing. "Lady Alara," he said, with the warmth of a man performing warmth for an audience. Asterisk, what a pleasant surprise. Asterisk. She smiled back with a smile she had perfected over 3 years, the one that was technically a smile and communicated precisely nothing of its maker's interior state. Asterisk, Lord Pemberton. Asterisk. The dinner continued. The conversation moved in its usual currents, around the table, through the predictable eddies of politics and property, and the season's social inventory. Edmund was charming in the way he was always charming. Generously, skillfully. The charm distributed evenly around the table in a way that included everyone and excluded no one, and yet, Alara had come to understand, genuinely meant nothing. It was a social mechanism, not an expression. The warmth of a lamp rather than a fire, serviceable and calibrated, but generating no actual heat. She had loved that lamp once. She had mistaken it for a fire. She considered this over the fish course and found that the grief it produced was smaller than she expected. Worn down perhaps by time and repetition, or perhaps diminished by contrast, by the recent experience of sitting across from a fire in a sitting room on Welbeck Street and understanding, for the first time in years, the difference. It was during the meat course that it happened. The conversation had turned. She was not certain how it turned. The mechanism of social conversation being sometimes impossible to trace. To the topic of the season's eligible parties, and from there to the question of unusual matches, and from there, with the inevitability of water finding its level, to the Duke of Ashvale. Someone mentioned the Headington Ball. Someone else mentioned the waltz. The table's attention shifted in the subtle, collective way of 12 people who have all been thinking about the same thing and have been waiting for permission to address it. Edmund set down his wine glass with perfect timing. Ashvale is an interesting case, he said, to no one specifically and therefore to everyone. Asterisk a good man, I believe. Well-intentioned. Though one does wonder. Asterisk he paused, in the manner of a man expressing reluctance to continue, which was the precise expression of a man who has rehearsed continuing and is now executing the rehearsal. Whether his interest in a gentle gesture, vague enough to be deniable, in a direction that was nonetheless unmistakably in Alara's vicinity, asterisk charitable projects, shall we say, is entirely in the subject's best interest. Some women, having been through significant difficulties, can become, asterisk another pause. This one carrying the specific weight of a word he was selecting with care, asterisk, attached to kindness. Disproportionately so. When you have been starved of a thing, even the smallest portion of it can seem, asterisk. Extraordinary, said the woman beside Edmund, one of Lady Forsyte's particular friends, leaning into the narrative with the enthusiastic incomprehension of someone who does not know they are being handed a weapon and used as a weapon simultaneously. Just so, Edmund said. Asterisk, one feels for her. Truly. Asterisk. The table hummed with the specific frequency of 12 people who have been given a story and are now determining how they feel about it. Alara felt the familiar sequence begin, the sequence she had run through 100 times in 3 years, the survival protocol. Compose the expression, regulate the breathing, present the neutral face, wait for it to pass. She began it. She was very good at it. And then something happened that had not happened before. It did not pass. Or, rather, it did not pass through her in the direction it usually passed, the direction of internal absorption, of swallowing the thing, and adding it to the accumulated sediment of swallowed things. It moved differently this time, as though the architecture of her interior had been rearranged recently, without her fully noticing, and the old channels no longer ran the same way. Something rose in her instead of sinking, and it was not rage. Rage was too hot, too uncontrolled, too expensive, but it was adjacent to rage, and it was also adjacent to clarity, and it was made, she thought, of a great many specific materials. 3 years of silence, and for words she had overheard in a corridor, and the face of a man who had looked at her across a ballroom, without looking away, and the plainness of he was wrong, and the weight of asterisk you are the most honest face in every room you enter asterisk, and the thing she had felt walking away from the park on Saturday, and going to bed on Sunday, and getting up on Monday morning, and sending Dorian Blackwell away from her sitting room to protect him from a man who was, at this precise moment, deploying the word charitable like a blade across a dinner table. She set down her own fork. The table, she noticed, had gone slightly quiet in the way tables go quiet when something is about to happen that is outside the usual program. Lord Pemberton, she said. Her voice was, she noted this with a distant, almost academic surprise, entirely steady. Not the steadiness of performance, not the careful architectural steadiness of composure being maintained under duress, but something quieter and more fundamental than that. The steadiness of ground. You have used the word charitable twice now in the last several minutes, she said. Asterisk once on Saturday, in conversation. Yes, I am aware of that conversation, as you perhaps did not intend. And once just now, at this table, in company. I find I would like to address it directly, since indirect address seems to be the preferred mode, and I have always found indirection inefficient. Asterisk. Edmund's expression had undergone a rapid series of small adjustments. Surprise, recalibration, the rapid reconstruction of pleasantness over something more brittle beneath it. Lady Alara, I assure you, I am not finished, she said pleasantly. She had learned the pleasant voice from him years ago, without knowing she was learning it, the particular register of warmth that does not invite interruption. The table was very quiet now. Lady Forsyth at the head had the expression of a woman who has set a stage and discovered the play is rather better than she anticipated. The Duke of Ashvale, Alara said, is a man of considerable intelligence and entirely sufficient self-determination to decide, without guidance, what constitutes a worthwhile use of his time and attention. To suggest otherwise is not concern for me. It is concern for your own narrative, specifically, the narrative in which your decision 3 years ago, was reasonable rather than small. Because if the Duke's interest is genuine rather than charitable, if a man of his standing and discernment sees something in me worth seeing, then what you decided, when you decided it, requires a different accounting than the one you have been keeping. She picked up her wine glass, took a composed sip, set it down. I do not raise this to embarrass you, she said. I raise it because I have been quiet about it for 3 years, and I find that I have, rather completely, run out of quiet. The table sat in the specific silence of 12 people who have witnessed something they will discuss for the remainder of the season, and who are, in this precise moment, collectively determining what their faces should be doing. Edmund looked at her. Beneath the pleasant reconstruction of his expression, something moved, something she could not fully name, something that was possibly, in its deepest layer, the specific discomfort of a man who has told himself a story and has just been handed a version of events that does not fit the narrative he has constructed. He said nothing. For the first time in her considerable experience of Edmund Pemberton, he appeared to have nothing ready. Miss Hale beside him was looking at Alara with an expression that was not readable. Something between startlement and a slow, dawning consideration, the look of a young woman encountering, perhaps for the first time, a piece of information she needs time to process. Lady Forsyth at the head of the table cleared her throat with the decorum of a woman reclaiming her dinner party from the territory it had briefly entered. More wine, I think, she said to the footman, and the footman moved, and the table exhaled, and conversation resumed with a slightly altered quality of air after a storm has moved through. The same air, but different in pressure. Alara ate the remainder of her dinner. Her hands were not entirely steady. She noticed this, below the surface of everything. In the private accounting she kept of her own body's responses to difficult things. Not steady, but moving, holding the fork, lifting it, continuing the ordinary motions of existence through the extraordinary motion of having finally, after 3 years of accumulation, said the things she had needed to say in the room where it needed saying. In the carriage home, Cecilia sat beside her and said nothing for a long moment. Then Alara. Yes. That, her aunt said, with the quiet, complete conviction of a woman who has been waiting a long time to say something, and has chosen her moment with precision. Was your voice. Alara leaned her head against the carriage window. The London night moved past in its lamplight and shadow. Something was happening in her chest, not the tight, contracted sensation she had been living with for 3 years, but something different, something that had more room in it, something that breathed. She thought about a man who had said you are the most honest face in every room you enter, and walked out of her sitting room when she asked him to, because he respected the asking, which was not a small thing, and which had not, no matter how firmly she had attempted to file it away and leave it there, stayed filed. She thought about the voice she had used at Lady Forsyth's table. The voice that was not a construction, not a performance, not the carefully managed product of 3 years of learning to present an acceptable surface to a watching world. The voice that was simply hers. The voice she had been before the Grantham Road, before the bandages, before the corridor outside Edmund's mother's dining room, and the 4 words that had turned her interior weather into a 3-year winter. Cecilia had called it her voice. She thought she knew where it had come from back. Not from courage, which she still was not certain she possessed in any reliable quantity. Not from anger, though anger had been present as a component. From something that had been growing, she realized, quietly, without her supervision, in the sitting room on Welbeck Street, over tea and fire and the careful exchange of truths too heavy to have been carried alone. He had called it back to life, without knowing he was doing it, without trying, without performing, without any mechanism beyond the simple, radical act of looking at her face and staying. She closed her eyes in the dark carriage. She thought, I have made a mistake, and I know how to correct it, and I am going to be terrified, and I am going to do it anyway. This, she suspected, was what courage felt like from the inside. Not the absence of fear, just the decision, made in the presence of all the fear, to move. She did not go to him immediately. This was partly practical. A woman of her standing did not call unannounced on a duke at his private residence, and the rules governing this were not ones she was prepared to discard without some consideration of the consequences, not because she feared society's opinion in the way she once had, but because she understood that the forms of conduct served purposes beyond mere convention, and that dismantling them carelessly produced its own variety of damage. It was also partly something less practical and more honest, the recognition that she needed a few days in the altered landscape of herself before she attempted to navigate it in someone else's company. The woman who had spoken at Lady Forsyte's table on Thursday night was a woman she was still becoming acquainted with. She needed to spend a little time with her before introducing her to anyone important. Friday passed in a state of muted aftermath, the particular quality of the day following a significant event, when the event has settled, and what remains is both the clarity of having done the thing and the complex, layered business of understanding what the thing means. She received no morning calls, which she suspected was because the social world was still determining its position relative to what had occurred at Lady Forsyte's table, and would require another day or two to complete its recalibration. She was not troubled by this. She walked the garden in the thin October morning light and thought about what she intended to do and how she intended to do it. And she felt, with a carefulness, a wariness toward the feeling, an awareness that it was early and fragile and not yet to be trusted with its own weight, something that might, if it continued and was not interrupted, eventually become hope. Saturday arrived with rain, the proper London variety, not dramatic, not the grand, operatic downpour of fiction, but the steady, gray, entirely committed rain of a city that has had a long time to practice in clemency and has developed a thoroughness about it. It streaked the sitting room windows and gathered in the angles of the garden and turned the street outside into a surface that reflected the lamplight back in wavering, uncertain impressions of itself. It was into this rain that the letter arrived. Not her letter. She had been composing hers in her head since Thursday night, assembling and reassembling it the way she assembled difficult things, with attention to structure and an awareness of what each word was being asked to carry. She had not yet committed it to paper, partly because she had not yet found the right beginning, and the right beginning mattered to her in a way she could not entirely explain except to say that the first sentence was the frame, and the frame determined the shape of everything that followed. His letter arrived at 10:30 on Saturday morning, delivered by a footman in Ashvale livery, who handed it to Hutchins with the composed efficiency of a man accustomed to delivering correspondence from a household where discretion was both expected and enforced. Hutchins brought it to the sitting room on a small tray with the particular expression of a butler who is not having opinions about what he is conveying and would like this noted. Ilara looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. It was heavier than a standard note, more pages, she thought, or heavier paper, or both. Her name on the outside was in the same handwriting she had examined on the calling card 3 weeks ago, spare, unhesitating, taking up exactly as much space as it needed. She broke the seal. It was 4 pages. She had not expected 4 pages. In her experience of Dorian Blackwell, in the accumulated intelligence of 6 interactions and 1 waltz and the growing internal catalog of how he moved through the world, he was not a man who used 4 pages when one would suffice. He was not, in general, a man who used more of anything than was precisely necessary. 4 pages from him carried, by this measure, the weight of 20 from anyone else. She read it by the window, with the rain on the glass and the gray October light, and Cecilia conspicuously elsewhere in the house, having developed a pressing need to consult with a housekeeper about something that apparently required her presence in an entirely different room. He did not begin with pleasantries. Of course, he did not. I am writing this because there are things I did not say on Monday that I find I am not able to leave unsaid. I recognize that you asked me to go, and I went, and I want to be clear that I intend to respect whatever you decide when you have read this. The purpose of this letter is not to override your decision. The purpose is to ensure that whatever you decide, you are deciding based on accurate information rather than the version of things that is currently being circulated by people with an interest in the inaccuracy. She felt her throat tighten slightly. She continued, I have not spoken to many people honestly in the last 4 years. This is a choice I made deliberately and have not previously had reason to revisit. I found the dishonesty, or rather, the performance of the specific social variety of honesty that is actually a form of managed concealment, more efficient than the alternative. And efficiency has been, since France, one of my primary organizing principles. It costs less than the other options. I am telling you this because what I am about to write is not efficient. It is the opposite of efficient. It is the kind of thing that a man of my disposition writes approximately once, if at all, and the writing of it produces a specific variety of discomfort that I have decided to experience anyway, because I have recently been in the presence of a woman who says difficult true things in the full knowledge that they are difficult, and I find I am no longer comfortable doing less. She set the letter down on her knee for a moment and looked at the rain on the glass. Something was happening in the region of her chest that she needed a moment to accommodate before she could continue reading. She gave herself the moment. She picked the letter back up. The night of the Headington ball, I crossed the room because I recognized something. I have described this to you already, and I will not repeat it in different words to make it sound more than it was. I recognized a person surviving a room rather than inhabiting it. And I recognize the specific courage that surviving requires when the room is structured to make survival unnecessary by making you invisible. I crossed because I recognized it. That is the honest account. What I did not tell you, because I had not yet admitted it to myself, is what I recognized after. Not in the ballroom. In your sitting room on Welbeck Street, on Tuesday and Thursday, in the conversations we had about France and Grantham and the things that are said in corridors that were not meant to be heard. I recognized, and I am aware that this is an unusual thing for a man of my specific history and temperament to say, and I am saying it regardless. I recognize someone I wish to know. Not as an act of charity. Not as a recognition of a shared condition, though that is also true. As a specific person, distinct from everyone else in my experience, with a quality of intelligence and honesty, and I will use the word precisely and without romanticism, courage, that I have encountered rarely and value entirely. I am not a man who is easy to know. I am aware of this and do not apologize for it, because apology would imply the intention to change it, which I do not have. I am structured the way I am structured by things I cannot undo, as you are structured by things you cannot undo. And I have found, in 6 weeks of conversation at a fireplace on Welbeck Street, that your particular structure and mine occupy the same space without collision, which is something I had not previously believed possible and have not previously experienced. I am not asking you to ignore the whispers. I am not asking you to subject yourself to additional damage on my account. I am asking only that you know, with the same certainty I would bring to any statement of fact, that what Pemberton is saying is wrong, and what the whispers are saying is wrong, and that the only account of my interest in you that is accurate is the one I am giving you now, in 4 pages, which I recognize is more than I have ever committed to paper in the service of a personal truth, and which I offer as evidence, if evidence is useful, of how much I mean it. Whatever you decide, I will respect it. But I wanted you to decide knowing the whole of the picture. You deserve accurate information. You have been given enough inaccurate versions of yourself by people who should have known better. Yours, if you will have it, Dorian. The rain continued against the glass. The gray light held its gray position over the garden. Somewhere in the house, Cecilia was consulting with the housekeeper about something that had now apparently required 45 minutes of dedicated attention. Elara sat with the letter in her lap and felt the full weight of it, not the paper, which was considerable for a calling card and 4 pages of correspondence, but the other weight, the weight of a thing said by a person who does not say things easily and has said this anyway, in full knowledge of the discomfort and the risk and the possibility that the saying will not be received the way the saying was intended. Yours, if you will have it. Not I am yours. Not the declarative of a man placing himself at a woman's feet in the romantic tradition of such gestures. The conditional. The offer, not the imposition. The hand extended across the ballroom floor again, in the form of ink on heavy paper. If you will have it, leaving the decision, as he always left her decisions, with her. In her hands, where he appeared to believe, as a matter of settled conviction, they belonged. She became aware that she was crying. This was surprising, not because the letter had not warranted tears, but because she had believed, after 3 years of practice, that she had developed sufficient infrastructure to manage the routing of strong feeling away from the immediate surface. Apparently, this particular feeling had found a gap in the infrastructure. She let it go. There was no one to perform composure for. The rain was crying too, against the glass, and the garden was wet, and she was holding 4 pages of the most honest thing anyone had ever written to her, and she cried without managing it, which was its own kind of relief. When she was finished, she folded the letter with care. She held it for a moment, the weight of it, the specific gravity of a true thing given freely. And then she set it on the writing desk, and she took out paper, and she wrote, without preamble, without extensive drafting, without the careful architectural attention she had been giving to imaginary versions of this communication since Thursday night. She wrote, Dorian, you asked me to have accurate information before I decided. I have read your letter, and I have my information. I am coming this evening, if you will receive me. 7 o'clock, I have a great many things to say that are also difficult and true. I find, to my considerable surprise, that I am no longer willing to leave them unsaid either. Elara. She sealed it. She rang for Hutchins. She sent it with the Ashvale footman, who had apparently been waiting in the kitchen with the patient composure of a man who had been instructed to wait and was very good at instructions. Then she went upstairs to find Cecilia. Her aunt was in the upstairs sitting room. It was immediately clear, actually consulting with the housekeeper about anything, since the housekeeper was nowhere in evidence, and Cecilia was seated in the chair by the window with a book open on her lap, at a page she had clearly not been reading, her eyes on the rain-streaked glass, and her expression the expression of a woman who has been waiting with enormous patience for footsteps on the stair. I am going to Ashvale House tonight, Elara said. At 7. I need you to come with me. Cecilia looked at her, at the eyes that were slightly red at the edges and entirely clear in the center, at the chin at its angle, not the rehearsed angle, not the calculated defensive angle, but simply up, the natural position of a face that has decided to be level with the world. Obviously, Cecilia said, and turned a page of the book she was not reading, and smiled at the rain, and said nothing else, because nothing else was required. The afternoon moved through its remaining hours with a different quality than the morning had possessed, not the stretched, grinding quality of time waiting to deliver an unpleasant thing, but the quick, almost insufficient quality of time that contains something you are moving toward rather than away from. Elara dressed with care, because care was a form of respect, and she had respect to give. She chose the deep green gown again, because it was the color she had worn at Lady Forsyth's table when she had found her voice, and she wanted to arrive at Ashvale House wearing the same skin she had been in when she decided to come. She stood at the mirror. She looked at her whole face. The scar on her left cheek caught the lamplight in the way it always caught lamplight, the way she had spent 3 years cataloging and managing and presenting her right profile to minimize. She looked at it. She thought about what he had written. The most honest face in every room you enter. She thought about what that meant. Not as a compliment, not as the kind, generous thing a man says to a woman he wants to comfort, but as a specific observation of a man who does not say things he does not mean. The honesty on her face. The record of what had happened to her, written in the most permanent available medium, worn without the ability to revise or retract. She did not turn to her right profile. She went downstairs. She collected Cecilia. She stepped into the carriage. The rain had stopped while she was upstairs, leaving the London streets wet and lamplit and reflecting. Everything doubled in the shallow puddles, the lights and the buildings and the narrow, dark sky between them. The carriage moved through this reflected city, and Alara watched it pass and felt the whole of herself moving toward something rather than away from it. And the feeling was, she searched for the word and found it. Enormous. Not comfortable. Not safe. Enormous. The way any true thing is enormous when you have spent a long time in the presence of smaller ones. 7 o'clock. Ashvale House. She was going. Ashvale House was not what she had expected. She was not certain, in the carriage on the way there, what she had expected. Something imposing, perhaps, in keeping with the man's reputation and the weight of the dukedom. The kind of London townhouse that communicates power through sheer architectural insistence. All columns and cold stone, and the suggestion that the building itself does not particularly care whether you are comfortable. She had prepared herself for imposing. She had not prepared herself for the quality of light that came through the tall front windows as the carriage drew up, warm, amber. The light of a house that is actually inhabited rather than maintained as a social statement. The light of fires lit in rooms that are used rather than fires arranged in rooms that are displayed. Hutchins, her Hutchins, not Ashvale's, she was still sufficiently nervous to appreciate the familiarity, handed her down from the carriage with the dignity of a man performing a task of significance, and Cecilia descended after her, and they stood on the wet pavement in front of Ashvale House at 7 o'clock precisely, and Alara breathed the cold October air and thought, "You are not surviving this room. You are choosing to enter it." The distinction felt important. She held it as they climbed the steps. The door was opened before they knocked. She registered this, the footman already positioned. The household having been, apparently, arranged around the expectation of their arrival, with the same quiet precision that characterized everything she had come to associate with this particular house's master. They were shown in by a butler of the specific, composed variety that exists only in houses where the standards are consistent enough to produce that quality of staff. Shown into a wide entrance hall that was, again, not what she had expected. Books on a side table. A coat thrown over the back of a chair in a way that indicated the chair was used. A vase of flowers, not formal, not arranged for effect, but a slightly imperfect arrangement of someone who had put flowers where he wanted them, rather than where a housekeeper had been instructed to place them. She was shown into a study. It was a room that had clearly been lived in for a long time and had accumulated, in the way rooms do when someone inhabits them genuinely rather than decorates them for presentation, the specific character of its occupant. Books everywhere, not arranged by height or color, but by use, some horizontal, some vertical, some bristling with paper markers. A desk with correspondence on it. A pair of chairs before a fireplace where the fire was substantial and unperforming, built for heat rather than effect. And at the window, the tall window overlooking the wet London street below, Dorian, who turned when they entered, and who looked at her across the width of the room with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the contained, guarded steadiness she had catalogued across 6 sitting-room visits. Not the controlled, purposeful directness of a man managing his presentation with the precision of long practice. Something more exposed than either of those things. The expression, and she recognized it slowly, with the specific recognition of something she had not seen clearly in a long time, of a man who has said the truest thing he knows how to say, and does not yet know what has been done with it. He was, she realized with a fullness she had not been prepared for or afraid. Not the fear of danger. She knew he was not a man who feared danger in the ordinary sense. The war had settled that question thoroughly and permanently. Something more particular than that. The specific, human fear of having been honest, and having to wait to discover whether the honesty was received or returned or simply noted and declined, which is perhaps the oldest and most ungovernable fear in the entire catalogue of things people are afraid of. She looked at him across the room and felt her own fear, the fear she had been carrying in the carriage, The fear she had been carrying since Thursday night. The fear that was not about him specifically, but about what it meant to choose something, to reach toward something, to uncurl the hand that has been closed for protection and extend it toward another person in the full knowledge that opening it is also what makes it possible to lose things. She was afraid. She crossed the room. She was not certain, later, what she had intended to say first. She had planned something, in the carriage, something careful and structured that acknowledged his letter and expressed her own position and maintained a degree of the composure she had been using as scaffolding for 3 years while she figured out whether the building underneath could stand without it. She had planned it carefully. She had planned it right up until she crossed the room and stood before him and looked at his face, the whole of it, the scar and the guarded eyes and the jaw and the particular quality of a man who has decided to be afraid rather than pretend he is not. And all the careful planning dissolved the way careful preparations always dissolved in this man's presence, which was with an ease that felt less like failure and more like relief. "I read your letter," she said. "I know," he said. "You wrote back." "I wrote back," she confirmed. "I want to," she stopped. Started again, with the precision she owed both of them. "You said that you have not spoken honestly to many people in 4 years. I want you to know that I have not been spoken to honestly, genuinely honestly, without management or calculation or the specific variety of kindness that is actually a form of condescension, in considerably longer than that. And receiving it," she paused again, because the next part required more steadiness than the previous parts, and she was assembling the steadiness as she spoke. "Receiving it from you has done something to me that I did not anticipate and cannot entirely account for, and am choosing, having thought about it for 3 days, not to run from." He was very still. The firelight moved across his face in its independent way, independent of everything, indifferent to the significance of what was happening in the room. "I sent you away," she said, "because I was afraid that what they were saying about me was true, not the part about being unstable. I have never believed that, even on the worst days. The other part. The part that suggested that a person in my position, having been through what I have been through, could not trust her own responses, could not distinguish between genuine feeling and the disproportionate attachment that comes from being starved of something, and then suddenly given a portion of it. And now," he said very quietly, "and now," she said, "I think it is the most elegant lie Edmund Pemberton has ever constructed, and I have decided to stop letting him narrate my interior life." Something moved through Dorian's expression. Several things in rapid succession, none of them small. She watched the move and did not look away from any of them, because he had never looked away from hers, and she understood now that this was the most fundamental courtesy two people could extend each other. The willingness to let the other person's face be the whole of their face, rather than the portion designated for public viewing. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for sending you away." "You do not," he said, with the specific certainty of a man who means it rather than a man who is being gracious. "You made the decision you had the information for at the time. I gave you more information. You revised your decision. That is not an error requiring apology. That is just thinking." She looked at him. The steadiness of him. The absolute, unhurried, unsentimental consistency of a man who treats her conclusions as the product of a valid process, rather than the output of a damaged instrument. She had been managed by well-meaning people for 3 years, advised, guided, gently steered toward positions that others had determined were appropriate for a woman in her circumstances. She had not, until Dorian Blackwell, been simply trusted to think. "Your letter," she said. "The last line." He waited. "Yours, if you will have it." She held his gaze. "I will have it." The fire settled. The room was very quiet. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not in the way such moments are sometimes rendered, with visible emotion deployed across the features in a way that communicates feeling to an audience. Quietly, the shift of a man who has been holding something braced for a long time and has been given, very suddenly, permission to put it down. He said nothing for a moment. "Then, there's something I should like to show you." He moved to the adjoining door, the one she had been peripherally aware of since entering the room, from behind which there had been, barely audible, the sound of a pianoforte, not played by anyone, the strings simply resonating in the way they do in old instruments in rooms with fires. He opened the door. The music room beyond was smaller than the study, more intimate, the furniture arranged for use rather than display, a pianoforte against the far wall, and a space cleared in the center of the floor that she understood, as she stepped through the doorway, had been cleared intentionally. Not for a performance, not for an audience, for the precise dimensions of two people. There was no orchestra. There was no ballroom. There were no 300 people with their watching and their whispers and their collective opinion about who deserved to occupy which space. There was a fire in the small grate and a lamp on the pianoforte, and the strings of the instrument still resonating faintly in the warm air, and the cleared space in the center of the floor. He turned to her. "Dance with me," he said. The echo of the first time, the ballroom, the outstretched hand, the whole room holding its breath, moved through the space between them and resolved into something different. This time there was no room holding its breath. This time there was no audience to perform for or against. This time the outstretched hand was not a public gesture designed to be read by watching people. It was a private one, offered in a room with no witnesses, but a fire and a lamp and Cecilia, who had remained, with the perfect discretion of a woman who has understood the evening's requirements, in the study. This time Alara did not search his face for mockery. She knew his face now, knew its economy, its precision, the specific quality of its honesty. She knew that what she found there would be what was actually there. She placed her hand in his. There was no music, strictly speaking. Only the faint resonance of the pianoforte strings in the warm air, the distant sound of rain beginning again against the windows, and the fire's quiet commentary in the small grate. It was not a proper waltz. The steps they moved through were the steps of a waltz, but the context transformed them into something that had no official name in the dance manuals. Two people moving together in a room of their own, with none of the external structure that dancing in public provides, which meant that every element of it was chosen rather than prescribed, was their own rather than the evening's. She was not counting. She was not performing the angle of her face. She was not calculating the light or managing the expression, or constructing the composed surface that she presented to the world. She was simply there, in the room, in the dance, in the full and present and unmanaged entirety of herself, including the left side of her face, and the 3 years of accumulated winter, and the voice she had found at a dinner table on Thursday night, and the 4 words she had overheard in a corridor that had taken up so much interior space for so long and were, she could feel, slowly, incompletely, in the way of things that do not resolve all at once, but resolve, beginning to be displaced by other words. Better ones. His words. Her own. He danced with the same contained precision as before, but something in it was different, something looser, she thought, some fraction of the perpetual holding that had characterized him in every context she had observed him in, slightly released. As though the room, with its absence of audience, permitted a quality of movement that the ballroom had not. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them looked away. "I want to ask you something," she said, as they moved through the turn. "Ask," he said. "The question you said you have not resolved. About surviving." She kept her eyes on his. "Do you think, is it possible, do you think that the surviving can become the answer? That it does not need to become something else? That two people who are good at surviving can simply do that together?" He considered this with the gravity it deserved, which meant for several seconds of actual consideration rather than the reflexive production of a comforting response. She had come to love this about him. The genuine, unhurried engagement with whatever was asked, the respect implicit in not answering until the answer was ready. "I think," he said, "that surviving together is a different thing than surviving alone. I think it may be what the surviving becomes when it becomes something." She absorbed this, turned it over, found it true. "Yes," she said, "I think so too." They danced. The rain moved against the windows in its steady, committed London way, indifferent to the significance of the room it was falling past. The fire offered its warmth, without condition. The pianoforte strings held their resonance in the warm air, a single sustained chord that was not quite music and was not quite silence, but was something in between, the sound of a room where something has been given a name it did not previously have. At some point the steps slowed, as steps do when the music is interior rather than external and is being kept by the dancers rather than the orchestra. They were barely moving, more standing than dancing, though the hands had not released, though the distance had not increased. She was close enough to see the scar on his neck clearly, the one above his collar that the whole of London had opinions about, and she looked at it without looking away, the way he had always looked at hers. And she thought, we are both marked, not diminished, not less than what we were before the marking. Simply, the people we became through the things that happened to us, which are not separate from who we are, but incorporated, integrated, part of the whole. Dorian, she said. He looked at her with the unguarded, unperforming steadiness that she had catalogued across a ballroom, and a dozen cups of tea, and 4 pages of the truest thing she had ever read. I believe, she said, that I am going to be in love with you. If I am not already, I cannot be entirely certain of the timeline. The corner of his mouth, the movement she had catalogued from the very beginning, the smile considering whether to committed. Fully this time. Not the small, brief, almost smile of a man who has forgotten how. The complete version. It changed his face in a way she had not yet seen and found, with the immediate and uncomplicated certainty of genuine response. Entirely devastating. The timeline, he said, is less important than the destination. That is very pragmatic, she said. I am a very pragmatic person, he said. And then, with a precision that was his primary language, and which he had learned to hear as his most intimate register. I believe I arrived at the destination some time ago. I was simply waiting for accurate information about whether I was alone there. She looked at him, at the scar and the steady eyes and the face of a man who has said the truest things he knows how to say and has been received and knows it, and is standing in that knowledge with the particular quality of a person setting down something heavy they have carried a long distance. You are not alone there, she said. The rain continued. The fire continued. The pianoforte strings held their resonance. And in the small music room of Ashvale House on a wet October evening, 2 people who had each spent years learning to survive rooms stood together in one of their own making and found, with a slow, complete, slightly astonished certainty of something genuinely discovered rather than constructed, that the room they were building between them was one they both intended to inhabit. 1 year later, the Marquis of Headington held his autumn ball. This was, by the accounting of London society, simply the annual repetition of an established tradition. The great rooms reopened, the chandeliers relit, the orchestra engaged, the invitations dispatched to the same 300 names that appeared on every list of consequence in the city. It was, by this accounting, unremarkable in its structure. The rooms would be the same rooms. The flowers would be arranged in the same towering urns along the walls. The champagne would be the same champagne, distributed by the same footmen in the same livery. And the orchestra would play the same Viennese pieces that they played every year with the reliable proficiency of musicians who understand that their function is architectural rather than expressive, to provide the sound that the evening requires rather than the sound that interests them most. Society's accounting, as Alara had learned, was frequently accurate about the form of things and almost entirely wrong about their substance. She stood at the dressing table in the bedroom of Ashvale House, her bedroom in her house, the possessive still carrying a slight quality of wonder she had not entirely lost in 12 months of habitation, and she watched in the mirror as her maid dressed her hair with the particular focused attention of a woman who takes professional pride in her work. The gown tonight was not green. It was the deep, particular blue of a winter sky just before dark. Cecilia's choice, presented 3 days ago with the authority of a woman who has been selecting her niece's wardrobe for significant occasions long enough to have developed reliable instincts about it. Alara had looked at it and known, immediately, that Cecilia was right, and had said so, which had produced in her aunt the expression of a woman for whom being right is both expected and deeply satisfying. The mirror showed her her whole face. She looked at it with the straightforward, uncomplicated attention of someone looking at their own reflection, which is to say, with recognition rather than appraisal, with the simple acknowledgement of this, is my face that she had spent 3 years struggling to achieve and had arrived at, over the course of the last 12 months, not through resolution or triumph, but through the gradual, unremarkable accumulation of mornings in which she had looked and found the looking less effortful than the morning before. The scar was there. It would always be there. She had reached, at some point she could not precisely identify, an arrangement with it, not acceptance in the dramatic, declarative sense, but the quieter and more durable variety of peace that comes from simply continuing to live alongside something until it becomes part of the known landscape, rather than the foreign intrusion. Dorian said it was the most honest face he knew. She had heard this often enough now, said in enough different contexts. In the morning, across the breakfast table, in the middle of conversations about entirely different things, in the specific, offhand manner of someone stating a fact they consider so well established as to require no particular emphasis, that she had begun, cautiously, to believe it. Not because she could fully see what he saw when he looked at her. She was not certain any person could see their own face with the clarity that someone who loves them can, but because she had learned, over 12 months of being looked at by Dorian Blackwell, that he was not a man who said things he did not mean, and that his meaning, in this particular case, had accumulated sufficient evidence to constitute something approaching conviction. The maid finished her work. Ilara looked at herself in the mirror. She thought, 1 year ago tonight, you stood at the threshold of Headington Hall and held your chin at a rehearsed angle and felt like a word spoken in the wrong language. She stood. She went to find her husband. He was in the study. Of course he was in the study, where he was always to be found in the hour before a social engagement he was preparing himself for with the systematic, slightly grim efficiency of a man who has never found public rooms easy and has decided to continue attending them anyway, which he had come to understand as its own variety of courage, quiet and consistent and entirely characteristic. He was standing at the window with his hands behind his back, looking down at the street below, and he turned when she entered with the immediate, unhesitating attention he always gave her, the kind of attention that does not need to be recalled from somewhere else, because it was not elsewhere to begin with. He looked at her for a moment. "Blue," he said. "Cecilia," she said. "Your aunt," he said, with a specific warmth he reserved for Cecilia, who had become, in the gradual, unannounced way of things that happened through proximity and shared meals and the accumulated evidence of consistent character, one of the people he trusted, which was a small and carefully populated category. Asterisk has excellent judgment. Asterisk. "She knows," Ilara said. Asterisk, "I have told her. It will ruin her." Asterisk. The corner of his mouth moved. The full smile, the one she had first seen in the music room a year ago, and which she had, in 12 months, never quite developed immunity to, which she suspected was not a failure of adaptation, but simply the nature of the thing. Asterisk, "Are you prepared?" Asterisk, he asked. She considered this, the genuine question beneath the form of it, which was not "Are you prepared for the ball?" but something larger and more specific, the question he had learned to ask rather than assuming, which was its own form of the respect he extended her in everything. Asterisk, "Are you prepared? Are you well? Are you yourself tonight, the full version, and not the diminished version that difficult things sometimes produce?" Asterisk. "Yes," she said, and meant it without qualification. He offered his arm. She took it. They went downstairs. The carriage to Headington Hall took 20 minutes through the October streets, which were damp with the early suggestion of the season's rain. The lamplight doubled in the wet cobbles the way it had been doubled the night she had driven to Ashvale House with Cecilia a year ago, going towards something rather than away from it. She sat beside Dorian in the carriage with Cecilia across from them and watched the city move past and felt she took an interior accounting, the habit of someone who has learned to monitor her own weather with care, steady, not fearless, because she was not constitutionally fearless and had stopped pretending otherwise. Steady. The way ground is steady, not because nothing moves on it, but because it is sufficient to bear the weight of what stands on it. "The foresights will be there," Cecilia observed, in the tone of someone providing logistical information. "Yes," Ilara said. Asterisk, "and the Hartwell party." Asterisk. Asterisk, "Yes." Asterisk. A pause. "Pemberton has gone to the country," Cecilia said, with the precise neutrality of a woman delivering information she finds neither surprising nor distressing. Asterisk, "Miss Hale, Mrs. Pemberton I should say, is not yet out for the season. They are expected in the new year." Asterisk. Alara received this information and considered what she felt about it, which was less than she had expected for some time to feel. Not nothing. The memory of 4 words in a corridor still existed, would probably always exist, as the residue of formative damage tends to exist. But it had been joined over 12 months by a great many other words, said in a great many other registers, by a man who understood the specific weight of language and deployed it with the care of someone who knows that words, once given, are not retrievable and should therefore be worth what they cost. And the ratio had shifted in the arithmetic of her interior life to the point where the 4 words were no longer the loudest thing in the room. Thank you, she said to Cecilia. Meaning, for telling me, and for how you told me, and for the 12 months of telling me things I needed to know in the ways I needed to hear them, and for the September morning when you arrived with 2 trunks and an opinion about everything and refused, with the magnificent, loving stubbornness of a woman who knows the difference between what a person wants and what they need, to let me disappear. Cecilia looked at her with the clear, sharp, entirely affectionate eyes of a woman who understands perfectly what is being thanked and considers it, in the way of all genuinely generous people, not particularly worth thanking. Obviously, she said, which was her word for everything that went without saying and needed to be said anyway. Dorian, beside her, said nothing. He found her hand in the fold of her skirt and held it, not dramatically, not as a gesture intended to communicate anything to anyone, simply because it was where his hand apparently wanted to be, which was the most unperforming variety of affection she had encountered, and the one she had come to find, without surprise, the most convincing. Headington Hall was exactly as she remembered it. The gilded doors, the chandeliers, the hothouse roses in their towering urns, the orchestra already midway through a Viennese piece, 300 of England's finest, arranged in their constellations of silk and broadcloth, the whole brilliant, complicated, occasionally cruel machinery of the season in full operation. She stood at the threshold and she did not hold her chin at a rehearsed angle. She held it at her own angle, which was simply up the natural position of a face that has made its arrangements with itself and is no longer conducting the negotiation in public. They entered the room together, and the room did what rooms do. It registered them, it whispered, it redistributed its attention, and then redistributed it again, the machinery of observation running its inevitable cycle. She felt the looking without being diminished by it. This, she had found, was what changed, not the looking, which continued, because the world continued to be the world, but the relationship to it. The looking used to enter her and find the same wound every time, the tender place that had been mapped and targeted. The wound was not gone. She did not think wounds of that particular variety were available for going, precisely, but it had changed its quality. It had healed into scar tissue, which is the body's remarkable, specific ingenuity, to turn the site of damage into the toughest part of the whole. She talked with Mrs. Hartwell, who was warm and genuine and slightly less awkward than she had been 12 months ago, the awkwardness having diminished in proportion to the number of conversations they had had since. She talked with Lady Forsyth, who had the grace to look at her with something that was not quite an apology and not quite acknowledgement, but contained elements of both, which Alara received with the equanimity of someone who has decided that accounting for old debts is less interesting than conducting the present. She danced with Dorian, properly, before the whole room, with the orchestra and the turning floor and the watching eyes, and she did not count the measures, and she did not manage the angle of her face, and she did not think about difficult or damaged or charitable or any of the vocabulary of her diminishment. She thought about the music room at Ashvale House, the cleared floor, the resonating strings, the rain against the windows. She thought, asterisk, this is the same dance. The room is larger. We are the same, asterisk. It was in the second hour that she saw her. She was standing near the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, almost exactly where Alara herself had stood 1 year ago tonight, with a champagne glass she was not drinking from and her right profile presented to the room with the precision of long practice. She was young, not more than 19 or 20, and her hair was dark and her gown was pale, and she held herself with the specific, effortful stillness of someone performing composure rather than possessing it. She was not scarred, not in the visible sense. Her face, as far as Alara could see across the room, was unmarked. But she had the look. The unmistakable quality of a person surviving a room rather than inhabiting it. The quality Dorian had crossed a ballroom to address a year ago, because he recognized it, because recognition calls to recognition across whatever distance exists between two people who have been in the same country. Elara was not certain what the young woman's particular damage was. It did not matter. Damage did not require a specific form to be real, and the form it took was not the point of it. The point was the standing alone at the edge of a room full of people. The point was the angle of the chin, the practiced, defensive, effortful angle that communicates to anyone fluent in the language. I am pretending I am all right, and I am doing it in the hope that the pretending will be sufficient to get me through this evening without further loss. Elara knew that language. She was fluent in it. She had spoken it for 3 years and had learned, slowly and painfully, and with more help than she had initially been willing to accept, that pretending is only ever sufficient for so long before the gap between the pretending and the truth becomes its own source of damage. She set down her champagne glass. Dorian, beside her, felt the shift in her attention. She knew he felt it because she had learned over 12 months of the specific intimacy of two people who have chosen to know each other without management, that he noticed everything about her with the same systematic, unobtrusive attention he brought to everything he deemed important. He looked across the room. He looked back at her. He said nothing. He inclined his head very slightly, the smallest possible gesture of endorsement, of go, of yes, of I am here, and stepped back, giving her the space to move. She crossed the ballroom floor. She was aware of being watched, but differently than she had been aware of it a year ago. Not with the tight, defensive self-consciousness of a woman bracing against a world she expected to find hostile, but with the simple ambient awareness of a person who understands that existing in public means being seen, and has made her arrangements with that understanding, and is no longer spending her primary energy managing the fact of it. She reached the young woman by the windows, stood beside her in the way that is not intrusive, close enough to communicate intention, not so close as to impose. The young woman looked at her, the quick, slightly startled look of someone who has not been approached all evening and is not certain what category of approach this is. Elara smiled, not the smile that gave nothing, the other one, the one that was actually hers. I was standing in exactly this spot, she said, *, 1 year ago tonight. *. The young woman blinked. *, were you? *. I was, Elara said. *, I had not been in a public room in 3 years. I had rehearsed the angle of my chin for approximately a week. *. Something shifted in the young woman's expression. The slight, involuntary recalibration of a person who has just been given a piece of information they did not expect and are not certain what to do with. She began. Stopped. *. I did not think anyone noticed. *. Someone noticed, Elara said. *. Someone always notices. *. She paused. *. The noticing is not always the variety you are braced for. *. The young woman looked at her, at the whole of her face, the scar included, with the specific, slightly searching attention of someone encountering a new piece of information and integrating it into a picture they are still assembling. Not cruelly, not with the voyeuristic interest of the merely curious, with the attention of someone who is learning something and is aware they are learning something. I am Lady Ashvale, Elara said. Elara. Miss Thornton, the young woman said. Clara. A pause, uncertain. I do not usually, she stopped again, the sentence having arrived somewhere she had not intended to take it. You do not have to explain, Elara said. I know what you usually do. You usually manage it alone, and you are very good at it, and it is exhausting, and no one knows. Clara Thornton looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were bright in the way eyes become bright when something true has been said to them. Yes, she said. Exactly that. I know, Elara said. I did it for 3 years. What changed? Clara asked. And the question was the honest question, the real question, asked with the directness of someone who has temporarily abandoned the social performance in favor of something more necessary. Alara considered it. She thought about the answer, the true, complete, unabbreviated answer, which was long and contained a duke crossing a ballroom floor and a sitting room on Welbeck Street and a botanical book given to an aunt and 4 pages of the truest thing she had ever read and a music room with a cleared floor and 12 months of being looked at by someone who did not look away. She thought about how to say all of that in the form available to her, here, in the middle of Headington Hall, to a young woman she had met 4 minutes ago. Someone crossed the room, she said. Asterisk, and I let them. Asterisk. Clara absorbed this. The orchestra shifted into a waltz, and the floor filled with couples, and the ballroom turned its glittering, complicated self around them. Clara looked at the dancers, and then looked back at Alara, and there was something in her face that was beginning, not healed, not resolved, just the preliminary thing, the prerequisite, the thing that comes before the other things are possible. Will you? She started, and stopped, and started again. Asterisk, would you introduce me? To someone? I do not. I have not been introduced to anyone this evening, and I think if someone introduced me I might. Asterisk. Yes, Alara said, before the sentence had finished. Asterisk, come with me. Asterisk. She extended her hand. Clara Thornton looked at it for the space of approximately 3 seconds, the same 3 seconds, Alara thought, that she had stood before Dorian's outstretched hand a year ago, searching it for mockery and finding none. And then she took it. They crossed the floor together, toward the fire and the conversation and the warm center of the room that had felt, to Alara, for 3 long years, like a country she had been deported from and was not permitted to re-enter. Dorian watched from across the room. He held his champagne glass with the looseness of a man who is comfortable where he is, in a room that has not been easy for him and which he attends anyway, consistently, because she is in it and because some things are worth the effort of the rooms they require. He watched his wife cross the ballroom with her chin at its natural angle and her hand extended to a young woman at the edge of things, and something moved through his expression, not the almost smile, not the deliberate, committed smile, but something quieter than either. The expression of a man watching something he loves doing what it is made to do. Cecilia appeared at his elbow. She looked at the same scene, Alara, the young woman, the cross floor, the extended hand, and said nothing for a moment. Then, there she is, she said. Not a question. Not a surprised observation. Simply the identification of something long known and long expected, finally visible in its complete form. The statement of a woman who had arrived at a townhouse on Welbeck Street in September with 2 trunks and an immovable conviction that her niece's story was not finished, had never believed it was finished, not for a single morning of the 3 years it had seemed to be, and has been given, in the fullness of time, the specific satisfaction of being correct. There she is, Dorian agreed. The orchestra played on. The chandeliers shed their light without distinction on the marked and the unmarked alike, on the surviving and the thriving and everyone in between who is simply, stubbornly, magnificently in the process of becoming. The roses in their towering urns gave their scent to the warm air. 300 of England's finest turned in their complicated constellation, and in the middle of it all, a young woman who had stood at the edge of things for 3 years walked toward the center of the room with someone she had just met and felt, for the first time in as long as she could locate in honest memory, the extraordinary, ordinary human experience of being accompanied. The scar on her left cheek caught the candlelight in the way it always caught candlelight, the way she had spent 3 years cataloging and managing and minimizing. It caught the light tonight without management, without minimization, without the rehearsed angle or the calculated profile, or the careful surface assembled for the comfort of a watching world. It caught the light the way a face catches light when it is simply present in a room, openly, without apology, as itself. What the accident had marked, it had not taken. What Edmund had tried to diminish, had not diminished. What 3 years of silence had threatened to bury, had not been buried, had been kept alive, against significant evidence that keeping it alive was unreasonable, by an aunt with 2 trunks and an opinion, and recovered, in a sitting room by a fire, by a man who crossed rooms and wrote letters and danced in music rooms with no orchestra, and said he was wrong in the tone of correcting errors of fact, until she could hear it herself, in her own voice, in her own sitting room, in the own full presence of her own complete face. This was what the scar could not take. The self that persists. The voice that returns. The hand that opens, finally, after everything, and reaches. Word count, 2,912. Asterisk, thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if Alara's journey or Dorian's or the small and enormous act of crossing a room for someone standing alone at the edge of things meant something to you tonight, please leave a comment below and tell me where you watched from and what part stayed with you longest. Like this video if you believe that damaged people deserve great love. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not too broken for the room. And subscribe to this channel because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about the scarred and the surviving, the marked and the magnificent, and the extraordinary things that happen when two people decide, against all available evidence, to reach asterisk. Until next time, thank you for being here.